Everybody, there's not a lot that I'm going to throw up by space communication, but we're repeating the menu. Involved with registration and compliance on that, but there are definitely some property.
Sorry, I'm having to switch.
You mind?
Jeremy, can you hear us yet? Oh, we can. Okay, all right.
Good.
So I just want to say on Zoom, we also have Jeremy Martin and Audra Caller. Both have joined us on, and Janice is up there too.
That's actually Shenley.
Oh, that's Shenley, okay.
That's the ghost of.
The ghost.
that, yeah.
of Janice.
So we've done the introductions, and we are now just talking about the history. The planning board has looked at short-term rentals, and we thought it was very important for a starting point to identify goals and objectives. And I think that, you know, mostly what we've come up with, and they run the gamut, but in no particular order off the top of my head, we were looking at available housing, and I want to be clear on that term because sometimes we mix in affordable housing, and I think we all know that affordable housing in Camden is it's almost a unicorn that we may not achieve. But available housing is the term that we've been the preferred term to use for that purpose. And then we're talking about safety, right? Because these unregistered, uninspected units run the gamut again of being in various states of repair, disrepair. There's no real way of knowing what they are and whether they meet code and whether they're renting out for the number of people that the house is actually, or the property is actually approved for. Character of neighborhood has been another concern. You know, I don't think we've had, well, I made the statement a while back that I didn't know we had any real issue with that in Camden, but there certainly have been in other municipalities. But then somebody mentioned something about the camp rentals out on the lake sometimes get a little rowdy. So, you know, there certainly is an opportunity or potential for that to be the case. And so we're looking at, you know, preserving the character of neighborhoods. And a sidebar of that is the fact that some of these places are operating essentially as a commercial business in a residential neighborhood, and so we want to make sure we're aware of that issue. And then also we have identified as one of our concerns or objectives is to make sure that we're not prejudicing our lodging industry, leveling the playing field a little bit, and making sure that if they're required to meet certain standards and inspections and goal, you know, things, that these properties also are held to some sort of standard that ensures, again, safety, but also a level playing field is something that we've considered because we do recognize the importance of the lodging industry to the economy of Camden. We tried to tie a lot of these goals to the comp plan, and I think you all know that in the comp plan there's a lot of discussion over available housing and workforce housing, and those are some of the things that we're looking at. And so I think everyone here at the table would share the goal that people who work in town are able to afford to live in town, whether it's someone in our police force or a school teacher or someone who works in the restaurant industry or other service industries. And you know, to the extent that we can create more available housing, we're hoping that that opens up the door for people to live here. And also, you know, I know a lot of restaurants, for instance, are having a hard time finding staff to hire. And a lot of that is just because people have to live 45 minutes away just to find an affordable place. So that's kind of the top level view. And so assuming that everybody's had an opportunity to review the memos and see that, I think we can just start to work down, but I do want to just stop right there and give anybody a chance to chime in or ask any questions. This is really meant to be a dialogue and not a, you know, a lecture series by yours truly.
Thanks, Ethan. I see some of those key pieces. I agree with the goals wholeheartedly here. I mean, to me, safety is a huge issue. I have personal experience with, you know, tragedy that can come with people who aren't meeting the building codes. And to me, these short-term rentals are small businesses, and they should be regulated as such. You know, again, not necessarily to, you know, put extra bureaucracy on top for the owners of these properties, but just because they are small businesses, the town should have some regulation on them, primarily for safety.
Anyone else?
My only question that I've had is, so we do have the registration process,
Correct.
and how is that enforced?
Yeah.
Is there any enforcement that's been happening, and how has that gone?
Yeah, I think if Jeremy's able, I think I would ask him to jump in here. It's enforced through the code enforcement office, but it is drafted under the police ordinance, so it's not a zoning ordinance at all. And so how has it gone? My guess is somewhere around 15 to 25% registered. And is that way too high? Way too high?
I think that's too high, Ethan. If you want me to jump in, I can. Yeah, so we have two ways of regulating short-term rentals in Camden currently. We have the definition in the zoning ordinance, chapter 290, which talks about a dwelling unit cannot be rented for less than 7 consecutive days. And then alternatively, we have, and that's it. It doesn't speak to any registration or anything. It's just in the definition of a dwelling unit. And then we have the short-term rental registration ordinance, that applies to unhosted short-term rentals, and we defined that. This was voted on by voters a couple of years ago now. That it only applies to those dwelling units that are not the occupant's primary residence, or it doesn't have a primary residence where someone's living there 6 months plus 1 day. To be honest, I mean, enforcement piece, it's really on a, if the homeowner or property owner is doing the right thing, because the only way to identify which units are being rented short term is to scrub all of the online platforms that are out there. That's VRBO, that's Airbnb. And it's really no community, you can't do it. It's not possible. You'd have a staff person actually booking nights all day long, trying to figure out where these are, because as you know, you've probably used Airbnb. You don't find out really where the place is until you rent it. And then how do you match up the pictures of the unit with our assessing database, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of pictures of any of these places, so it's really, really hard. So we thought, our hope was that we would gain some compliance and try to understand with that short-term rental registration ordinance, what's out there. And to be honest, this year, I think we've captured, probably 15 unhosted short-term rentals that have applied, and now some are starting to reapply again. And those people are doing it right, and they, no one is living there as of someone's primary residence, so they're doing it, going through the process. From a life safety perspective, there is no inspection as part of that registration. However, we do ask on the applications how many bedrooms are being rented. We have run into situations where they've put on the application a number of way exceeding what we assume that property has. So we've actually gone into property files, determined how many bedrooms, whether they comply, and the code officer and fire inspectors have gone out on a couple of occasions and said, whoa, this is not a rental, like this room cannot be rented as a bedroom, and we've addressed some of those issues that way. And there are firms out there that assist municipalities with enforcing and administering a program like this and monitoring. They have proprietary, technologies that they use to scrub the data that's out there on the platforms, and then use the assessings database. They've given me a couple of estimates when they've run Camden, and depending on the time of year, there's between 275 and 350 short-term units available in Camden. Depends on the time of the year and everything when you scrub, but that's the range of numbers that we're looking at. I would add that we also have people in Camden that rent out bedrooms on Airbnb, which aren't dwelling units. They're just someone living in a house and they have a spare bedroom and they rent that out. We haven't really looked at those kinds of things. Well, that's kind of a very different thing than a whole dwelling unit because someone's there. Does that answer your question, Stephanie? It's really, really hard to respond. The only way that we can enforce it is when people call us or we find out that someone's renting one. I mean, I found out in the last 2 weeks, I think three houses that are being rented as short-term rentals with no registration. So we're going to follow up on those, but it's very, very hard. It's complaint driven.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I have a question, Jeremy, from that life safety perspective, what does an inn or a bed and breakfast have to do for, let's say, life safety issues, egress, no stairway, windows, smoke CO detectors? What type of inspections do they have to have and certifications in that regard?
That's a good question. Yeah, they do need to get inspected annually by the code officer and the fire department. Keep in mind the fire department too, now they have their certified code officers, and they are looking at egress, alarm systems, CO detectors. Those are all requirements. So they're using the life safety code and the existing building code to ensure compliance when they're doing their inspections.
And that's annually?
That's annually, yes. Yep. Did that answer your question, Tom? I mean,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I will also say that with a commercial building and anybody that has a commercial place like that, they would have to have two means of egress for insurance purposes, whereas a homeowner is not necessarily put to that same standard.
Right, right. And this raises a very good point as far as the registration, compliance with that registration, and then also the inspection and enforcement. It's all about people hours. And then on top of that, you know, one of the things that we've looked at, and we can get to the memo at some point, but one of the things that we've looked at is, you know, if the enforcement arm, if the penalty is high enough, then you have more motivation. So if someone's looking at $1,000 penalty for not registering, they might take it more seriously than if they're looking at $100 penalty for not registering. So that's one thing, and I'm not talking about per day, but if we could discuss any of those things. And one of the things that we've talked about, I think from a planning board perspective also, is if you have people, you know, basically by affidavit, you know, swear that this is what they have, number of houses, number of properties, number of whatever, they're feeling a little more like that's a, you know, rather than just filling out a form, it's a little more definite, and that they're held to something. And if there's, you know, as far as like the fees for registering and inspecting, that they kind of go hand in hand. If we could increase the fees for registering, then we have more money to hopefully hire, you know, more, or dedicate more man or person hours to inspection and enforcement. And so those are things that we're looking at. Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, so I think this was probably one of the first things that came up when I first was on the board in 2017, and it was, there was a committee that was made up of some people from the lodging industry and some from maybe CDAC, or, and they had put quite a bit of time into a report with recommendations, and they even had, I believe, an attorney draft an ordinance, or, you know, something close to an ordinance. And it took up a lot of time just to, you know, just to talk about it, because it's one of those things where you listen to one side of things where it's like, oh, there's no real regulation and safety and all these things that you agree with, and then the emails start pouring in from all of these different cases of people who rent out things, and it you know, the devil is in the details in terms of who you're targeting or not and what the goals are. It had started to feel a little bit to me before that it was, the momentum behind it before was so much driven by, from the competition angle, from the lodging businesses, that it just felt a little bit like, you know, maybe not done for the same reasons as some of us would have wanted it to be done for. It's like, you know, the lodging industry isn't necessarily the best ones to say they're concerned about affordable housing and dark streets. And so I think it's good for it to be having the planning board really the driver behind this, and saying this is what the goals are going to be is important. But after going through lots of meetings about this, we sort of settled on, okay, well, everybody was paralyzed, because you're talking about impacting people's businesses that we all know and like, and everybody's affected on many sides. So we ended up saying, what we really want to do is just be able to quantify it. So let's just start with this registration thing, so that we at least have ideally some numbers with what we're working with. That, you know, that was after a lot of talking about it, and then we passed that, and it's been a little bit frustrating to find that that was the recommendation, and now we're failing at even just getting people to register. I'm not sure how hard we're trying at that, but it does speak to the fact that no matter what we do, it takes like a significant amount of staff time, it takes board time, so like finding a way to do something, not biting off more than we can chew. Anyway, I don't have any, I agree that it's all a concern. It's every other community ultimately has to tackle this issue. The way that we have it right now, that minimum stay of 7 days is, I don't really think in the best interest of a lot of people, because some people want to, you know, we've banned short anything less than 7 days. And for the person who just wants to come with their family for the weekend and rent a house, it's not necessarily, staying at an inn isn't necessarily the right thing for everybody. And so I mean, I think it's good that we tackle all this and maybe have quotas or something so that it is, if you want to come to Camden just for the weekend, it's not only a hotel that's the
Well,
option.
we know that, just to jump on a couple things, we know that there are lots of people who are also evading the minimum 7-day.
Right.
Either they're booking for 7 days and they're staying 2 nights, they're like, so that's already anecdotally we know. I think the other thing, just to sort of, that I wanted to sort of piggyback on what Ethan was saying earlier, is the scenery, the sort of the broad conversation about this has changed a lot, particularly in the last 2 years. We've been talking about this on the planning board for probably a year and a half, and even in that time, the number of towns in Maine and New England that have enacted, like, it's a very different scene on how communities are reacting. And the other piece of that is that we're also seeing third-party nationwide companies coming into the vacation rental market and purchasing properties in town strictly for, so it's, that whole scenario has changed a lot. Some of that's really just happened even in the last 2 or 3 years.
And Patty, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, Stephanie, one other thing that I know Airbnb has, and I don't know what the cost to the town would be to sign up for it, but if you are somebody who's trying to put your rental, short-term rental out on Airbnb, if we have a connection with that site, they can require the person to put in a license number, which would probably be based upon the naming convention for our, license and whatever that may be. So I thought that was a good option, too.
Right, so basically you're saying that Airbnb and maybe VRBO, we don't know,
Yeah.
would
I'm not
have
sure
an
about the
option for us to say, in this zip code,
Right.
you need to have a license number in order to,
Yeah.
and then link up with that. And that would definitely, because people are relying on these third-party platforms almost exclusively. I mean, there are some private, local businesses that have gone global or more national, whatever. But I also wanted to address the 7-day stay. Just one second, then I'll get to you. The 7-day stay thing, I think we have a lot of people who rent for 2 or 3 days, Allison, but then they don't rent for the rest of the week, sort of. So that, I think that for going way back in Camden has been sort of considered complying. Like, it doesn't have to be 7 days, but maybe one rental per 7-day period is sort of how it's been read. I don't think it's been enforced at all, and of course, there's almost no enforcement. And the other thing is, Jeremy's talked about these several different, groups that he's talked about that do the scrubbing, and he can have them come in and present to us what their work looks like. They're trying to sell us a product. So they'd be coming in and saying, here's what we've learned about Camden, and they'll give you a snapshot of Camden on a certain day where they have, 250 rentals available, and we can't always determine, obviously which one is a primary residence, which is unhosted, all of those things, but it would give us a better snapshot of what we're looking for. Yeah, and go ahead, Sophie.
So, thank you. So any other town who has enacted some regulations to limit short-term rentals seen an increase in availability of workforce or affordable housing?
Well,
Because I struggle to make that to understand that economic link.
Okay, I will make the case, and then I will let Pat jump in on that. I don't know if she's had those conversations or not, because Pat did a lot of the legwork for us in talking to other towns and reviewing their ordinances. The case I would make for available housing is simply this. If you take off the market private people buying, or private people or corporations buying houses strictly to put them into short-term rentals, unhosted, okay? If you take those people out of the market, that by its definition increases or decreases the number of purchasers, right? And then if you also take those properties and you put them into either the real estate for sale market or the long-term rental, standard rental market, then that increases availability. So it's an upward and downward pressure in both directions that would, it's not a magic bullet. It's not gonna say, you knock out 100 short-term rentals and all of a sudden everybody can afford to live here, or everybody that wants to work here can afford to get a place. But what you are doing is you're alleviating some of that pressure from both ends, because you're taking people out of the buyer's market and you're taking properties off the short-term rental market and adding them to the pool. So from that perspective, just, you know, I'm no economics major, trust me, but just from a logical standpoint, over time, that is going to have an effect. And if we're talking about in town, 200 units that are short-term rentals that are unhosted, and that's just, you know, I'm picking a number out of the air. But if you have 200 units that are that will then either enter the real estate for sale market or go into the long-term rental market, then that will make an impact over time. And so that's what we're looking at from the availability perspective, is putting these properties back for the people who want to live and work here. Now, we can't guarantee that someone's not gonna buy a house and live here for a month or 2 months a year, and then the house is dark for the rest of the time. You know, Jeremy did work in Bangor on a dark houses ordinance as well, and that's something that we can look at also, where they actually pay a higher, I think it's a higher fee, taxes or something that goes to the town for people with dark houses. I know, but I'm not saying it's good or bad, but there are things like that.
That's just a state law thing that you're not allowed to do.
They do it in Bangor. There's places that have them, so.
Charging a different tax rate for,
It's not a tax rate, it's an assessment fee. But the thing I wanted to just jump on is that this is something we also have to kind of look at regionally. And the piece is that if we're taking 300 houses out of the long-term residential market in Camden, then the people who might normally be looking at those are going to the neighboring towns, which traditionally have been more affordable. And so we're pushing, so this is why we talk about accessible or available housing. Right now, you can't rent an apartment long-term in Knox County, basically. There's nothing available because so many units are getting pulled. And that's kind of through the whole range of price. And that's why all of these communities, and we're trying to do it a little more proactively and a little more holistically, but
I'm just trying to figure out, you know, if removing short-term rentals from the market actually mechanically increases the supply of long-term rentals. Number one, I'm not sure I understand how that's possible, and if that has ever happened. The second thing is the incentive seems to be misplaced. We need to create more incentives for long-term rentals and not necessarily penalizing short-term rentals. Because again, to me, economically, those two things don't, but I'm desperate to hear if there are examples where those towns actually increase the available supply of long-term rentals when they started regulating short-term
Right, and
rentals.
so the timeframe is very short on these. I think Pat will back me up on this. It's been a year or two, some of these ordinances have been in effect. Is that correct? Is anybody longer than that?
Some, I think our hardware is longer than that. I'm not sure about Falmouth, but Cape Elizabeth and Kennebuck, I think were just in that time frame.
Yeah. So do you want to address do you have anything on Sophie's concern about the dynamic of reducing short-term rentals, increasing actual housing stock, available housing stock?
No, but I did like her talking about an incentive for long-term rental. I think that would help. I'm not sure how we would do that offhand. And I don't think it's a magic bullet like you were saying. I was thinking even if you could get a small amount of extra homes that are there for long-term rentals, I think that would be good.
Yeah, and we did talk about that, like, you know, if we could just get 5 more houses.
Yeah.
I mean, right now you can't even rent, as Christo said, you can't even rent in Knox County. And you ask anybody who's trying to buy a house, it's also, you know, quite competitive and challenging. Allison?
so in terms of the goals here, is it mostly from a safety perspective? Do we want short-term rentals to be safer or more fair? Or are we actually looking at trying to, I mean, I don't see any scenario where Camden's gonna like ban short-term rentals. It's just gonna be politically impossible. Nobody, I mean, even if we got, realistically, I mean, you saw when they tried to do this in Rockport. But like if the whole main motivation is affordable housing and a few more houses on the market, I mean, that can become, but we don't let people build apartment buildings in town. I mean, you
Yeah.
can't build an apartment building that has 4 stories. I mean, that's how traditionally, we would solve the problem so much faster if over at, near Hannaford, there was an apartment building or something, or a,
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like there needs, I've always supported at least having some kind of process where we know where these rentals are and all of that. But if we get into, I worry about trying to bite off too much.
Yeah, I think, you know,
Right
I
now?
mean, one of my key points all along has been that Camden is this vacation seasonal community. We're always going to have some rentals, whether that's camps, whether that's summer, you know, there's always going to be some of that. And we don't want to take away that, but that we can try and convince, it's not one particular, it's, to your question, it's not, the goal isn't one of these things, it's all of these things. It's saying, let's make them safer, that let's make sure that they're putting, you know, they're not putting undue burden on infrastructure. When you know, we talk about these houses that are being rented to 10 people and it's a 2-bedroom house. And they're in town, you know, what's the septic, what's the, you know, the parking, like the cars, all of those factors. But it also can help shift some of the housing back into permanent residential, whether that's, and again, that's why we sort of say, it's not necessarily the traditional affordable housing that we're talking about, it's just making it accessible to long-term.
I mean, would it make sense just to have a fee? The other thing is say, okay, this takes the town a lot of time and people are making money off of it. Should there just be instead of trying to stop it right off the bat, just say there should be a fee that sort of shares some of that revenue with the town
yeah.
so that we
There's
have
no one
money.
that's trying to stop short-term rentals. What we're focusing on as a planning board is we're focusing on the unhosted, non-primary residence short-term rentals. That's our focus, because we feel like that is the biggest bite of the apple. That is the place where we can make the most impact. People who are renting out their property that they live in, and they leave for a month or 2 in the summer and they rent out their property, nobody's going after that. If, you know, at least that's not the planning board's goal. People who have an extra room in their house, nobody's talking about that. People who, you know, have any kind of person who's a permanent resident who wants to rent out their property, even up for, you know, -1 day, half the year, nobody's really talking about, you know, those. We want to register and get those into the safety. Those we definitely want to do, but we're not talking about banning those. From the planning board's perspective, what we mostly have looked at is if we were going to ban anything or limit anything, it would be those non-primary unhosted. And that's those are the properties that are being run basically as a business in a residential neighborhood. And they're not regulated other than they're just asked to register. As you've heard, we've had very little compliance, but there is some compliance. We've talked about some different ideas, and I'll throw these out there as far as, you know, the nature. The other thing that happened, that's changed, I think, Allison, since 2017, when the committee worked together, and it was, as you said, sort of lodging driven. We've had, across the state, many communities have passed variations of short-term rental regulations, and that's what Pat did such a great job of sort of bringing in. I think we have a very good cross-section of what types of different regulations are. So you look at a place like Cape Elizabeth, their focus has been on almost more preservation of the neighborhoods, okay? It seems to ring true for Cape Elizabeth, but they've looked at it from a perspective of, are these ruining our neighborhoods? Who's watching these properties? What kind of, you know, monitoring, you know, what kind of regulation is going on? So Cape Elizabeth looked at that and said, okay, well, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and so some of those things were limiting the number of unhosted short-term rentals, the number of days a year that they could rent that property. So it wouldn't be full-time, full year, it would be a certain number of days or weeks out of the year. One thing that they allowed that we, you know, could consider is abutting landowners, right? So if somebody has a property and then next door they have a property and they want to rent that property, it certainly does answer that, that part of the neighborhood, sort of, it at least addresses it
You've
somewhat.
found ones that address because that has come up a
That's a
lot
Cape
before. It's
Elizabeth,
like,
that's a Cape Elizabeth ordinance, they have that in there, the other ones do not. But there is some logic to that, right? That there's like, you have an abutting landowner, they live there full-time year-round, and they can monitor and make sure that that house doesn't, you know, sort of disrupt the peace and disturb the neighborhood. It will still be sort of a come-and-go kind of place, right? You're gonna have different cars there every week and that sort of thing, but it would definitely be better than not having anybody around, or a property manager who lives in Boston. So we definitely recognize that that's something that's open to discussion. I know Mr. Thackeray's here, and he's proposed that. It's exactly his situation. And, you know, we haven't come to a conclusion on that as a select board or planning board. We do, you know, I will say personally, my personal position on that is that I would rather see that property into the regular housing market. That's my personal position, but it is not necessarily the position of the planning board. So, you know, the ideas that are being bandied about, whether it's, you know, some sort of, motivation, what was the word you used? Incentive, right, to put these into long-term rental. I'd like to hear a proposal on what that might look like. We certainly would consider that. But we are looking at trying to get a grip on what we have and then work with all the different stakeholders and see what would be the best for Camden. And so whatever we do from a planning board perspective is going to go to the select board, and then it will or will not go to the voters, right? And that's how it works. So we aren't going to decide anything, but we are going to propose what we think is best. And what we came here for and why we're having this conversation is to sort of understand what your concerns might be, where you lean, not getting any, you know, written in blood promises that we're going to pass this or send this on. But our hope is, as a planning board, is you will consider that we have considered all of these issues. We've held several workshops, and we've taken some testimony, and we have, you know, from our perspective, looked at these, and I think the planning board, I think I speak for the board when I say that we are inclined to ban or limit unhosted, non-primary short-term rentals. That's where we are leaning.
Non-attached.
And I worry that will be so controversial that it will mean that other aspects of what we want to do don't get passed.
Right, and that's possible, and, you know, sometimes you send things along and they don't pass.
But what about a quota system? Instead of
well, that is another strategy, I think, Bar Harbor.
They had, you can have limits. So let's say we put out some number, and once we reach that limit for these types of rentals, you can't have any more.
I think numbers are like 10% of your available housing stock, something like that.
8 to 10% across the country is when communities start looking at capping them, it's generally 8 to 10%. I looked at this not too long ago, and I think, if I remember correctly, we had like 3,600 units in town. If I plus or minus, I don't remember the exact number. And if you look at that 3,600 and the number that the online firms that help communities with this estimate 270 to 350, you know, we're under that. We're at about or under that 10% or 8 to 10%. So I think right now we're probably in a good place. And that the board probably, I mean, most recent conversation, as I recall, board, I think you were content with those numbers on kind of like the initial thought of this. As far as, I just wanted to comment about the monitoring enforcement on the STR piece. I get it. If the challenge, Allison, has been that the firms cannot scrub the data using their proprietary software with our data, because we don't know. Yes, people apply for homestead exemptions, but not everybody. So unless we have a kind of a more robust registration programs that picks up things that are beyond the primary residence, it's going to be really hard to ensure that we're capturing everybody in it. I'm just pointing that out. That's a reality.
In terms of just putting things on the paper, sending things with people's tax bills, just some of the basic things that, like, there are all kinds of people out there that just haven't heard about this that would be willing to do a $100 license fee and
and respectfully, that ordinance that was passed was a select board ordinance, and the enforcement of that lies with the select board.
they actually don't put us in charge of.
Well, you certainly have the option to pass thing saying, let's send out a notice with our tax bills, that's within the select board's
I mean,
purview.
really, that's supposed to be a staff recommendation based on goals, so
Okay, well, that is
this,
all, I mean, again,
this was
it was a select board
ordinance was,
ordinance.
no, this ordinance was a staff recommendation also. We didn't just say, this is what we want to do, even though town staff thinks it's
Right,
stupid.
but let's not, you know, assume responsibility for where that ordinance lies. It was not a planning board ordinance, it was a select board ordinance.
Let's take a look at the Kennebunkport. Let's
The other thing, just, the whole point of today's session and a lot of this is knowing that this is gonna be some contentious issues. And that's part of why we're having the conversation, is to not just say, here's,
Right, that's the thing, is it was
But-
really hard, it was unexpectedly difficult before, even for some of us who were very much feeling like, yeah, we need to do something about this. It became a paralyzing thing because there will be massive amounts of like, at this stage, there's not a lot of community input because not a lot of people have found out about it. But it will be much bigger.
I would just disagree, because we've had significant community
But it'll
input.
get more.
It will, but that's my point.
Yeah.
Let's consider incremental progress here. And
Oh,
I'd
yeah.
like to use Kennebunkport as an example. If we actually take a dive in, if everybody can look at Kennebunkport, they seem to take a very modest approach at, and then I think they say at the end, maybe even more potential, additional regulations may adopt more. And I like that approach personally. I don't think you need the 100% solution now, and this might be the 100% solution. But if you prioritize your goals, which to me, I've already stated my number one goal here would be safety. I can tell you that in an emergency event, black smoke, power's out, if you don't know where you're going, like you're a guest, you don't have a chance. You get 1 or 2 breaths, and then that's it, okay? Carbon monoxide overcomes you very quickly. So that's why I think safety is number one here. These people are not familiar with these places. And we're not regulating, we don't know if these places, there's a small business, keep in mind it's a small business, and we don't know if there's proper egress, including egress windows, proper stairs, and smoke CO detectors, and fire extinguishers, although those are not that emergency scenario so much that I'm envisioning. But still, Kennebunkport, I think, does a good job of addressing those. If you look down the list, it's not onerous for the person who wants to own and operate a small, short-term rental, but it gets the ball rolling in the right direction, in my opinion. So take a quick look at what they did. And for me, that would be maybe a good model to start with. Sometimes you're gonna have people who, if they can't meet these basic criteria, which I would suggest are good basic criteria, they're gonna weed themselves out. And then some of these other problems that maybe the planning board would like to see addressed do become addressed. Because basically, some of the things that are rented now become unrentable.
Which things do you like the best? Is it that they have the standards, or is it they have a formula for the numbers?
To me, it's that they have certain standards that if you want to have a short-term rental, you're going to have to meet these criteria, and there's an inspection involved. And I would suggest that the fees that the town charges covers the expense of the
I would think that would be the intent of the fee. I mean, the intent of the fee should do it. I mean, we've heard today and yesterday of things that, some things are tough to do, but just because some things are tough to do doesn't mean they shouldn't get done.
Yeah.
And in this case, you know, things are tough to do because of, one, the numbers appear to be high, and two, we don't know what the numbers really are. But Jeremy has mentioned being at capacity and unable to enforce because of the height of the total numbers that may or may not be true.
Yeah,
I am interested then in, we've got to find out what we don't know. When we don't know the exact number and where these all are, that's a thing that's hard to track. To me, there's then value in the, you know, solution that Jeremy had mentioned to me in a conversation prior to the election about determining whatever the solution was, doesn't matter, but what matters is there somebody that we can actually pay that will help Jeremy to monitor what's really going on. So that's a good thing in finding out, okay, so how big is the problem? Yeah, we may have to pay to find out how big that problem is, but it was relatively small cost compared to the people's lives that were affecting. So that, I thought that is, for me, one of the things we should consider, even though I know it's a sales pitch when they come in and say, buy my software. It's something that we should find out what that real cost is, so we can do a better job of finding out the real numbers. And the other thing that I am interested in is the leveling of the playing field, not only in comparison to the inns, but also in comparison to the people who have legitimate short day rental businesses. Some people really want to stick to the 7 days. I talked to some of them, just randomly ran into them. And two, there are other people out there in the world who are not adhering to that. And I don't think that's fair to the people who are trying to do the right thing.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely correct, and I agree with all.
So you gotta find out how big is the real deal.
Yep.
Don't make up numbers, find out what the numbers are.
If I may, I'm getting confused by our conversation, because are we looking at the same type of regulation for unhosted short-term rentals and short-term rentals altogether? Are we looking at different segments and addressing different issues?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Or are we, because the Cannon-Brookport ordinance is about short-term rentals.
Yes.
So are we designing two different streams of regulations for unhosted and hosted?
Yeah.
Or are we bundling them all together? If you
Yeah,
could
so I think
clarify that.
that's a great question, and it's undecided. If Tom indicated, liking the Kennebunk ordinance mostly for the fact that it was sort of incremental in getting the safety issue up front, which is a huge priority. I think a lot of the planning board members leaned a little more towards the Cape Elizabeth ordinance, and if you see in there, the primary issue there is getting, you have to have definitions. And so we've worked on the definitions, and they are included in the packet. But basically what they have is primary unhosted, primary unhosted, and then 7 acres plus, which is a very odd thing, but I think the idea is that you have enough land between you and the next property, you're not gonna disturb them. Their goals were much more towards the preservation of neighborhood and the peace, preserving the peace. That's Cape Elizabeth. The planning board is coming from the comp plan, the directives in the comp plan, and looking at the goals, which are repeated in there numerous times, to provide workforce housing. And we can't just provide workforce housing. We can do other things, and we've looked at, we did some things, a whole slew of things last year and it's based some on what the legislature has done as far as trying to allow for ADUs, accessory dwelling units in town, smaller lots, all of those things that we did last year that all passed the voters. Those are all designed to, again, give incremental, but some relief to the some options to develop housing in town. They don't just automatically in 1 year or 6 months create 75 units that all of a sudden relieves all the pressure and everybody that works at Peter Rotz can live here. We all know that. But the reality is that one of our primary goals is clearly the following the comp plan's directive to work for available housing. And so that's where we're coming from. We definitely have talked about, we have individual members. I mean, she is a lodging owner in town, and she has definitely voiced the need for the level playing field. She didn't bring that up on her own, we had already considered it, but she certainly believes that. Tom is here, he says safety is really important. We all agree with that, so we're just trying to find that balance. But I think that's the definition, Sophia, is definitely one of the key things, is what, if you're going to regulate differently, then you have to define what you're talking about. And registration for all sort of would be a motto that borrow from Bernie Sanders. Registration for all, right? Everybody gets to register their short-term rental. That's something that we would like to see, okay?
For even the hosted?
Even for hosted, right? Because we want to know where they are, and we want to be able to inspect. I mean, those are things that we think are really important. From that perspective, if you have a registration requirement for all short-term rentals in town, which we do not at this time, we just have unhosted, I believe, right? That's what the ordinance covers. If we had one for all short-term rentals in town, and you had a penalty of $1,000 for not doing it, people are gonna take notice, right? And you do have to get the notice out to them, you send it with their tax bill, you put it in the paper, you make sure people are aware. People obviously are voting on, I'm just throwing a number out there, it doesn't have to be $1,000, but maybe it's, $100 a day for not registering. And how do we find them? We don't know, but we're trying to get to a point where we understand what we're dealing with. To Chris's point, we can use the firm and bring them in and have them give us an idea of what the scrub of the sites look like. Those aren't absolute, right? They're just gonna give us a good ballpark. That even still, we're not gonna be definite because there are other people doing it. And so we're here to hear concerns and like one of the things I think Cape Elizabeth does, and I'm not sure if I have this right, but they have, I think, something about, that maybe you can remind me about certain number of days that an unhosted non-primary could be in the market. And from a planning board perspective, we had talked about, it's just a number, again, we picked out of the air, but what if it was 6 weeks, right? 6 weeks out of the summer, you can rent your house, unhosted, non-primary, and you make the decision whether those 6 weeks are better than renting it full-time for the year. We'd much rather see it in the, for a full year rental. I think most people can agree with that, but that's something we've talked about. So there are other options as far as limiting, the number of days or weeks that somebody can do it. And again, our planning board perspective, and I wasn't at the last workshop, but I did watch it the other day and got a chance to, see what everybody talked about. And it seems like we've been pretty much, from our perspective, pretty firm on targeting those unhosted non-primaries.
Yeah.
That's where we are, and that's why we wanted to talk to the select board, because we want to see how you feel about that. We don't have to agree. Again, this will go to the voters. We would ask that if we do something like that, even after a discussion like this, we might go back and do something that is contrary to what you have expressed. And then you have a choice to say we are or not going to pass this on to the voters. That's your choice. But we would hope that it would go to the voters, because the voters in the end, we all work for them. And we're trying to represent them the best we can. And so I've got a bunch of hands up. I'm gonna go, since Steffi hasn't spoken for a while, I'm gonna go to Sophie and then to Allison.
Mine's a pretty short one. I didn't read the zoning that you referenced here, the chapter 290 zoning.
Yeah.
Can you give a short?
Right, this is the one that was just recently, last year, I think, passed.
290, Ethan, is the definition of dwelling unit.
Oh, right, that's just, okay, so that one is very simple.
Okay.
That one is simply just that, under the word dwelling unit, we have something in there that it may not, the last line of that dwelling unit definition says, and this is all it is, a dwelling unit is basically any building that's, lived in. A dwelling unit may not be rented for periods of less than 7 consecutive days. And that's been the law here since 2009, and it may be before then. And so, if you have any dwelling unit in town, and you're renting it, you can't do it for 3 or 4 days and then turn it right over and do it for another 3 or 4 days in that same week.
So can I do a part B to my question? We keep saying that these are businesses that are being run in residential areas. Is that a zoning non-compliance, or are they not complying with zoning by doing that?
That is, there's nothing in the code that outright forbids it. So if we were to define them, just say, change the definition and say, if you were running a full-time rental business, then it is a business, or a short-term rental business, then it would require to be in a commercial zone, or we could do overlay districts. It gets pretty complicated, but you could approach it from that angle, absolutely. We don't have anything on the books.
I will say I know a few people who have filled out the form and registered, and also have registered with a business license in town to be fully compliant. There are a few people who have taken that step, but it's like 3.
The overachievers.
People who know the rules and say, I read all the rules and I'm gonna follow them. So but that's a very small piece, and those are people who literally have a property that is just rented and is just in short term.
And I just want to follow up on my thing. So, were you addressing
Yeah,
just that issue?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so our inn is in a residential zone, and I believe that we have a special exception to have a business in a
Right.
residential zone.
That's sort of a grandfathered in
Yeah.
type of situation. So Sophia?
Sophie,
Sophie, sorry.
no worries. I like the idea of going after unhosted units first and having a stepped approach, because that could be sending a message to hosted residential units that, hey, we're going after them and we want you to comply at the same time. And if you're not doing that, then you're next, right?
Yeah.
So I like this idea of not going for the whole universe at once, but having a stepped approach with a communication plan that's gonna help people understand what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve. But I think that's I do wanna, I don't know how many cases like yours, Rick, are of people who have an abutting property. It's small, but I don't know if we need to, I have a question mark about this. Is this overkill if the owner is a full year resident next to the property? Do we need to consider that an unhosted short? I don't know. I think it's a part of the definition, but also try not to over-regulate stuff that doesn't add any benefit to the market, basically.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
That's a good
So
point.
this is Sophie's question, because I've got Allison on waiting on another question.
It is.
Okay.
I just wanted to throw out that that exact situation is in existence. And there's a gentleman in Camden he bought the property next to him and he's registered that as an unhosted. And he's come to the workshops with the planning board and he's demonstrated some support. He may be there, but he understands, I think, what the town's doing. As far as trying to understand the unhosted versus the hosted, the firms that I've talked to, they cannot, based on our definition currently of how our short-term registration ordinance is, what's regulated are those that are not somebody's primary residence. And they cannot, with their system and with their technologies, figure that out. And nor can I, right? We just don't have that ability. So if we're gonna, and I agree with Tom's point on the life safety is critical because and I'm just bringing this up because it ties it. I think if we're going to register, we need to register them all, and they could be in a tiered fashion. Ones that are primary residences, or someone owns the property and they're a resident of Camden, or they're not. We can have a tier situation because they are transient guests. They're similar to hotel guests that go to a bed and breakfast or a hotel or a motel. Those people don't know the life safety features of that facility. That's why inspections are done. That's why certain code requirements are in place for facilities like that. And people, you may go into a house and it's code compliant, but like Tom says, you don't know where that door is necessarily in that state of emergency that, a tragic situation can be. So it is important, I think, from a life safety piece because we're not just talking about regular people living in these homes. These are transient guests that come from away, and they're here for a few days, just like they are on hotel. But it's important to pick up both of them if we're going to license them and register them. The life safety features of a dwelling unit are different than they are for a hotel, motel, bed and breakfast. We would make sure that whatever, the dwelling unit complies with residential dwelling unit code requirements. And that's what I think Kenny Bunkport did. And I agree on the Kenny Bunkport piece. I just wanted to stress that in order to get a real idea what's out there, if we're going to move forward, we do need to capture them all. That doesn't mean we need to capture those that are like the situations where someone is renting out a bedroom in their house on Airbnb. That's a different scenario. Because someone's living there right there. I just wanted to clarify, because that's the struggle. And Allison's mentioned it, and I know Chris brought it up. Can we figure out what number we are? How do we get there on the unhosted? The only way to do this on the numbering is to really engage it and register them all.
Yeah, and just to follow up on the registration compliance aspect. The ordinance was passed was imperfect because it had no teeth. And so that is certainly a primary goal here, is that if we're going to pass a registration ordinance, no matter what else we do, It has to have some teeth in it, and that's where I come in with the penalties and signing of an affidavit or that sort of thing, that you're not doing this or you are doing this, and then put a real penalty in place. And, the penalties can be waived, they can be lenient, they can be adjusted, towards, certain circumstances that may, mitigate why somebody wasn't able to follow the code or that sort of thing. But at some point, people have to step up and register their properties. And we can make that happen, or at least make it much more expensive not to be done by putting some sort of, penalty in place. And I think that's the first thing, because as we've heard, just take this whole thing. We get a list from one of these groups that says, here are 350 rentals in town. We literally have no idea to the extent that they're unhosted or not. And then you can take that, if you were able to get all those, and you were actually able to get an address, which I don't think you can from this group. But if you were able to identify those properties and get an address, you could have somebody who you pay to cross-reference them against the homestead exemptions in town. And then you would have maybe closer to 75% identification of which ones are unhosted and not, but not a guarantee, because some people don't do homestead. So there's no perfect method going from the sort of the front-loaded part. It's just an idea, it's just a ballpark. So that's why I think the enforcement element is so critical to the registration compliance aspect. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's why I wouldn't mention the word lenient when you're talking about let's have enforcement. Let's just do it.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, no, I hear you.
And I did see that when I read through our ordinance, it seemed like that's really cheap on the penalty of $100, I think. Whereas the other one that was noted was like, $1,000 and so many, $1,500 for the instance and so many dollars a day. That seemed like it had teeth.
Yeah, one suggestion would be to keep the monetary amount down, but, the second offense, the higher amount, or even say, you're out, no more short-term rentals for you.
Yeah, that's
There
certainly.
could be a warning,
certainly
there could be,
Right,
I mean,
and then,
some communities have tiered fee structures. The more properties you have in rentals, the more expensive it is to register each one. Like there are a few options there of how you would stagger. But the idea is to be clear that all of them are being identified, and that's kind of the goal. The other thing we talked about is the infrastructure cost. I mentioned a little while ago. Of people, we talked about people not knowing the safety protocols, but they also don't know
Not to park on sidewalks.
where to park, what to do with their trash.
Yeah, the
Like, we
trash
literally
is
have
a big
people who are like taking the trash and either leaving it on the sidewalk, because they're like, well, I have trash, So there are those things that are happening, and again, if we can identify all of the short-term rentals and have them part of the system, then we can make sure that all of those things are explained to the renters. And so that's another piece of the whole thing.
And,
As Tom said, develop the standards, make people have the basic standards, and those standards that were listed in Kennebunk, I think it was.
Yeah.
They don't seem all that unreasonable, it's what people should normally do, have a, for a regular house, make sure you have a smoke alarm in the bedroom, that's not insurmountable.
Yeah.
And identify, and the fees, I would think what you'd really want to do is your basic fee is what you'd want to cover your administrative costs.
Absolutely.
And if that administrative cost is having to go with some company with a piece of software that will help you manage it, the fee should cover it.
Right, well, then that would definitely, I think we would envision it would cover that, plus the cost of someone on the ground who would do the inspections and the administrative costs of doing the registrations themselves.
Attorney time, it always ends up being more time than we think, and it seems like everything we say about, okay, develop standards and then enforce them, and for some reason, and it's not on purpose, the town does have a really hard time enforcing existing ordinances. And I don't know why exactly that is, because it all sounds easy just to say that we're gonna do it. But like, for instance, right now, there's, we passed an ordinance about styrofoam floats. And that, there are penalties, there's all that stuff written into that ordinance. We gave everybody 5 years. And right now it's like, oh my gosh, there's somebody in the harbor that has styrofoam, and what do we do? And we're gonna try to work with them. And just the amount of time that it is taking us to discuss this as a select board it's that's one infraction. And so I don't know what the solution is, but getting town staff to figure out what they would really need to be able to enforce this kind of stuff, and being realistic maybe about what the fees would need to be. Because the 7-day thing, that when you get to the bottom of it, they've basically thrown their hands up because and declared it unenforceable. And I believe that, but it seems like nobody thought that was going to be the case when it was initially passed. And how do we avoid getting into that situation again? And that's why we rely on inn owners generally scrubbing the database and saying, I think this person's doing this wrong, and they send lists to the town, and the town tries to follow up. It's like all of that time that it takes for Jeremy and somebody else to sit around and talk to somebody who thinks, so making the fees sufficiently
Yeah, to
high,
be
but
clear, we're not talking about Jeremy doing this, we're talking about hiring somebody. to,
I know, but
you
but no
dedicate-
matter what, it ends up being Jeremy
I mean,
doing
can I
it.
say- I'm not really gonna throw up my hands and say we can't
I'm
do it because it doesn't.
I'm not
get
saying
enforced.
that.
Can Jeremy
because-
respond?
I'm
Yeah.
saying that we should be fully, if we're gonna do fees that are supposed to cover the costs, we
That's
should
realistic.
be really realistic and really,
Absolutely.
because we want people to actually be able to do it. I think we might think I'm more against this than I
It's not
am.
my- it's not my-
Okay, so the other, it's just that I've already had to go through months and months of this and realized, like, watched everybody kind of fizzle out on it to this imperfect ordinance that got passed that's now not being enforced after. So, but, okay, I had the other question to just say, Jeremy, when I.
Jeremy, you got a
Jeremy's up
question?
there first.
I just wanted to chime in on the fees, and that, Allison, it's a very, very good point. Chris, you brought it up too. And Tom, someone needs to pay for this service. And that same goes for the lodging licenses we have, the vitulers licensing that we have. I mean, I'm going to be bringing forward some new license fees to you folks to actually make them pay for the services we're providing. I mean, we do bed and breakfast. Some bed and breakfasts, I think, pay $20 for a license fee. I mean, for short-term rentals, and I think vitulers licenses are 25, and our inspectors go out, we do inspections, Janice does the paperwork, we put it on an agenda, you guys approve them, that's for $25. I mean, someone needs to pay for that fee. And for short-term rentals, I mean, if you think there are some houses going for thousands of dollars a week in Camden, all summer long. And if you're looking at a fee of, say, $300 even to cover the cost of, say, administrative time, plus the time and I will say these firms that can do this for you, if you have a robust enough ordinance that they can manage and they monitor the whole system, they send out the notices, they require you got to license it annually through them, and then they send those to the municipality. The inspections need to be done for it to get approved. I mean, if you're talking 300 units, say it's $300, I mean, that's $90,000. The firms to do this, we've gotten the price in the ballpark of $10,000 to do this. So, I mean, I think with adequate fees, you can definitely do it, but we just need to make sure that, what we're doing, the community wants, and it's appropriate for the community, and it's enforceable. And that means something a little more robust than we currently have, because the piece of primary residence, that's the fault of the existing ordinance, and that's where enforcement struggles. I will say, in terms of enforcement, I mean, there are occasions where the town may struggle on enforcement on some things, but we do enforce things every single day. You just may not know about them. So I'm just throwing that out there. Like, people are not scofflaws. We're not letting people get away with things that really matter. We're enforcing things appropriately in town. Some things may take a lag. Obviously, the styrofoam did, but we do enforce these things. And the comment, when we get complaints, and we've gotten a handful of them, notices are going out to those folks, and we're following up on them. And we're making sure that they're doing it right, the best that we can, based on the information we have.
Thanks, Jeremy. I want to let Allison speak to her question, then Pat, and then John.
Okay, so accessory dwelling units, how would those be?
Yeah, that's a good question, Allison. And we're actually, and this is a whole nother subject matter, but it's definitely tied in here. and it needs to be. The state passed the housing rules last year, a year ago. They recently extended the deadline for another year for municipalities to comply. Now, this requires a number of things for municipality to address and allow in a community. That's, you've got to ramp up your density. You have to allow accessory dwelling units, and you have to have an affordable housing provision in your zoning ordinance. This is mandated by the state. They just came up with those rules within the last month and a half. We have moving forward the affordable housing overlay piece that's moving forward. The accessory, and we've kind of divided this into those three categories, and we're tackling them separately. The accessory dwelling unit, Shenley is working hard on making sure our ordinance works with that, but we're going to have to tie that in with the short-term rental piece. Currently, our definition of accessory dwelling unit that was approved by voters a couple of years ago says that accessory, we allow them by right now anywhere, as long as you comply with septic rules and all that, and lot size. I say lot size, that's just for the shoreland zone and septic properties. But we said that those accessory dwelling units had to be somebody's primary residence. That, if that's the case, that's fine, and we can leave it. But you know, we got to make sure we address accessory dwelling units in the short-term rentals. I think that's an appropriate, you know, it's appropriate probably to leave that as is, because then at least it keeps those accessory dwelling units somebody's primary residence. It would then not prevent them from renting it out in the summertime, right? Because primary residence is six months plus 1 day.
I mean, how many ADUs we have in town, you know?
I don't know, but since we approved, I mean, keep in mind, we had accessory apartments that had a different definition prior to the amendment that we did a few years ago. So it's hard to separate those out. I'd have to go through old assessing records and our staff, code office records. But in the last, since we approved those accessory dwelling units, I think we've probably done about a dozen of those accessory dwelling units. Now, we say on their
enforcement on whether those are primary residences. Or
well,
not?
we say on the certificate of occupancy that's issued and on the permitting documents and all that, that it is required to be someone's primary residence. How you enforce that moving forward, again, that's the conundrum that not just Camden's in, every community's in. And the only successful programs are those communities that have engaged these firms to do it, because it requires such technology to really understand where these properties are. I mean, it's beyond a planner and land use person's ability to figure out, scrub all this online platforms and really find out where that property is and who owns it.
Do they really give us addresses though?
What's that? They will give you addresses once we're engaged in it, and it's actually part of a registration requirement. They will pick up all of those because it'll be Camden specific. If you're in the town of Camden, you have to have a short-term rental registration number before they'll post it online.
So that, okay,
It
they
ties in
can't,
with the third
they
party
can't
level.
figure out the addresses with the existing.
No.
Correct.
That, I mean, that really requires a lot of local knowledge when he is going on those databases,
Yeah,
because I can point them out, I'm like,
Somebody
oh,
with a lot of
that
time on
one,
their
that
hands,
one.
Allison could probably do that.
Drones and
Yeah. So that, these are all real concerns. Definitely, from the planning board perspective, we want to stick with the ADUs being a primary residence, because that was the purpose of that ordinance, was again.
Accessory apartments.
And accessory apartments.
No, there are no ADUs, there are accessory apartments.
Oh, that's what we changed it to? I thought we-
What?
No,
Been that way.
we've never had,
But then we didn't do ADUs yet?
It's the same thing, more or less.
well, yeah,
Jeremy
but,
says same difference, so.
Yeah,
Danny
big
knows.
difference, like,
so, but the targeting of, so I guess now we have another one of those definitions in our ordinance that says those things built after such and such a date, so we'll have to distinguish between
No,
accessory
no.
They're
apartments.
gonna get swept under the ADU ordinance when we do get that, is that right, Jeremy?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So we're gonna retroactively ban accessory apartments from being short-term
That's the way
rentals?
they are already.
No, because it's the ones that were built before.
There's a lot going on here, but you got to keep in mind that there's right? There's the 7-day minimum that's still in effect, right? And then you also have those, except we didn't have a size requirement before, and now we have a size requirement, a maximum for the accessory apartments that was approved 2 years ago. And so moving forward, that's something the planning boards, we have to have a conversation, Allison. I mean, this is, to be honest, I think just it's important to remember there's so much here that we're talking about. And when you look at November election and when things need to be done, there's no way to get something ready for that because there's so much involved and so much community, I think, input that's going to be taken as a part of this, that we're going to do it right. And we're going to dive into all of these different issues. I think that's what's been so good about the progress that the planning board's been making is, I mean, they spent, again, almost 2 years on this. It's on and off, but it's been about 2 years. And they dove in at other communities and to see how they're doing it, see what's working, what's not working. I know Anita Brochus Scott and Pat both had talked to planners in other communities just to try to feel for, is it really impacting? Is it being enforced right? How that's all working. So we're getting good information. And I think it's important to just, if this is the direction the select board wants to go, then I think it gives the planning board some good direction moving forward. Although, like Ethan says, they may just move something forward to you guys, but it sounds like you are on a similar page in addressing this in some fashion. I think that's what the board's looking for.
You mentioned there was a lot of information. What were a couple of the good things that worked well that these towns did? And what were a couple of things that
This
didn't?
is probably for Pat to answer, I think, because she's done more of the conversations.
One of the things they do recommend is to keep it as simple as you can, the short-term ordinance. And compliance actually wasn't that bad in some cases. I did want to say that some of these towns have used insurance companies to do the actual inspections. So that would alleviate somebody from within the town, I think, doing it. And one of the, I think it was Rockland, I'm not sure who else, they did community work groups. Whether that would help us or not, I don't know.
What did the community work group do?
The community work groups brought in different sectors from the community to go through planning, or what do you think of these scenarios? What type of feedback can we get from you? Here are our thoughts, like the planning board would say that to the community groups, and they would provide feedback essentially.
Like a focus group, kind of?
Yeah, all of that.
So what were some of the things they tried that didn't work?
Some of the things they tried that didn't work. I know I've read in at least one case an outright ban of all short-term rentals.
It didn't pass, or it didn't, like, they actually put it into place and then they had problems with it, or?
There could have been two of those scenarios. I know that South Portland has banned unhosted short-term rentals in their residential districts, but they have a city council, so I think that works a little different from the planning board.
Well, it's still an idea, it's still a concept.
Anyone can.
I'm interested in what was tried and failed and what was tried and worked.
Yeah, to the extent that we, again, Pat and Jeremy was right, Anita also, who's not here right now, was a former member, but did a lot of work just calling up and speaking to people, getting their feel. I think the general impression was it was going pretty well, and there weren't any major, concerns. Like there were things that they would tweak, and there was advice that they would give towards, like, how to make it run smoother and getting education and notice out to people. That's a huge part of the, the piece of the puzzle. But we did talk about, we've added on Falmouth on our list. But we did talk about, like, we could go around, we could go down to Booth Bay, we could do, we could get umpteen more, everybody's looking at it. I don't think there's a municipality along the coast that hasn't at least had a conversation about short-term rentals. But we decided that we had a pretty good cross-section. We're certainly willing to expand it to look at South Portland and others, but we thought that these towns we picked were close enough in character and size to Camden that they gave a good representation. I think you do see a pretty good, spattering of what does and does not work or could not work,
I think it's a little, as we said earlier, most of these are only a couple years old, so it's like, it's easier to say, here's what's working well, rather than for communities to be like, well, that didn't work, because they just don't know yet. But they can sort of identify.
And we seem to know it didn't work for us.
Well, I mean.
$50 a day penalty
Yeah.
and a $100 registration fee didn't work, yes.
I was just gonna suggest.
Well, we haven't even given the penalty, we haven't even
I don't
penalized
think we
anybody.
levied that
So
at
it's-
anyone, right?
It's not
I
the
agree.
penalty that's the problem, it's our ability to.
Given the time and the rest of
Yeah.
the agenda, and sort of following from what Jeremy was saying,
Public comment is what we're looking at?
well, I'm thinking, yeah.
John had his hand up a while back.
Can we just go over the 7-day thing really quickly? Are you gonna leave that in, like, are we gonna still try to keep the
Yeah, I
7?
think we've felt that the 7-day rental minimum is something that we feel is appropriate. It doesn't mean that you have to rent for 7 days, it just means that you can't do more than one every 7-day period. So it is, I hear you.
But that's not really clear to people, like, you can
Well,
find
and-
that out by being an
and again,
insider.
So I think just a lot of sort of
Right.
the other side of this is to, you know, elsewhere in ordinances that we've gone over and reworked in the last 2 years as a planning board, a lot of what we've been doing is also just clarifying existing language.
Yeah.
And to sort of make that policy a little more clear. And again, by codifying all of this and saying, here is a standalone policy with definitions that clearly sets out what the timeframes are, if we want to look at maximum number of days, all of those things would happen as we review the whole ordinance.
Right, we won't have to rely on that definition anymore for our only source.
Yeah.
I know, it's just those companies have problems too sometimes, because you'd have to, like, if you go, some places you can't actually even choose to rent for less than 7
Right.
days. And we've already declared that as like unenforceable, so how's it gonna be enforceable that?
Well, okay,
You could rent for 3 days, but the property cannot then be rented for the subsequent 4 days out of that week.
As long as we're sure there's a technology solution for that.
we don't know, but it's
That's what
worth
we're trying to get,
looking
that's
into.
what we're trying to get.
I mean, that'd be a question for the people who are gonna do the monitoring, like, if we bring in a firm like that, to say, can you manage this part of it?
Right.
Right, and what I would agree with you 100% on is, let's not carry on something just because it's in our code now, that is completely unenforceable, right? It
Right.
just doesn't make any sense. So, if we're gonna have it, we have to have a means for enforcing it. I think that's fair, and I think that's a goal for this entire ordinance. It needs to be clear, simple, and enforceable. And what we have right now is, you know, it's clear and simple, but it's not really, I mean, it is enforceable, but we didn't put enough money into it with the registration fee and enough penalty into it, in my opinion, to make it enforceable, because we don't have the staff to go out and do it.
What's the penalty for the 7-day, for violating the
Oh, I don't
7-day
know what
thing?
that is, that would be Jeremy, can you speak to that?
I think, if I remember correctly, it's land use violations are a minimum of $100 up to $2,500 a day. Per day,
Yeah,
per
but we've never
violation.
done that, so we don't know.
Right, but I mean, but if, you know.
It's
again,
not easy to, I mean.
Oh, it's, oh, yeah,
it's
that's what
simple.
It's probably the hardest part of it, is that in identifying the unhosted. But I want to let John speak, because he has been so patient over here.
I forgot what I was going to say.
No, you didn't.
If I'm to make a point, some of the language about we're targeting, unhosted units, and I'm not really on board with some of that. I think they're different, and they might need different registration fees or a different component to the regulation that's assigned to them. But as we have a discussion at the planning board level, I think from our perspective, from the select board, if you can concur with the goals that we're presenting, we can hash out some of the details before we bring it back to you. I'd be supportive of the more incremental approach, if you will, and try to have a more robust registration program for all, so that we can start to get a better handle on what's out there and the amount of information and education that you can do just as part of the registration program can go a long ways to making sure that the community can benefit from short-term rentals. You know, the people who own the property, the visitors that are coming up, the overall economy, and avoid some of the life safety issues or some of the neighborhood problems that arise from some of these unhosted facilities. So I just wanted to make that point, that I'm not necessarily, I'm a little uncomfortable with the language that we're targeting these people. We're out to, we'll get these people first and then use them as examples for the other folks down the line.
That sounds very draconian.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, we do like
But it does
visitors
work,
here.
it does work.
Do you wanna, some public?
Yeah, well, I want to before we wrap up here, and then I'm going to give the public some time to speak, okay? But go ahead, so.
I just had, so on the point of view of why are we doing this and when we're going to present that to the voters, I think, sticking to a safety benefit would be great, because I'm still on the economic benefit, I don't think we're there yet. And on changing the character of neighborhoods, every time we vote on anything in Camden, the first thing people say, oh, it's going to change the character. So I don't think, it's such a subjective topic that I don't think it's going to help. But safety issues, I think, are immensely motivating.
Yeah,
So I would focus on that.
So it's
Because we only
like
need
safety.
7, we don't, can I finish, please?
Yeah.
And so I mean, I don't want to get into a long discussion.
No,
Maybe
no,
you and I can carry this on another time.
You
But I'm
have-
curious about the resistance to the what's in the comp plan as far as, providing more workforce housing. And that appears numerous times, and then the resistance to the economic argument that taking some of these out of short-term rental and putting them into either the regular housing market or the long-term rental.
Do you have data? Do we have data? We don't, so it's
To me, it
just,
seems logical. Again, I'm not an economist, so if you want to carry on, we can certainly look at that, but it seems pretty logical to me.
but what's logical is, I mean, there's many things that are logical that are not supported by data. If we can support our arguments and hypotheses with data, fine. But if we can't, let's not put
We
it
can in
forward.
other communities.
Number of recently sold homes that are now listed as short-term rentals. You can,
Right, that's what, to go on with what Sophie was saying, and that's where I was thinking she was ending, is that safety is important, and then the other piece is informational. If we can do those two things without being too oppressive, I personally think that the long-term goal of doing certain things to make other housing available is probably too far down the track at this point, but that's, it's a big audacious goal.
Yeah.
But safety is a good thing.
Yeah.
Make it informational, so it's not overly oppressive. It's a good start to do an incremental piece.
Yeah, I would argue that, I appreciate your perspective. I would argue that, for instance, and we didn't bring it in on this one, but South Portland clearly is on a available housing goal. And, you don't know until you try something. But to me, it does make sense. From a logical perspective, I will look and see if there's any data on it.
Me too.
Sophie.
And I will
I'd be
share it with
happy
you.
to. Yeah, we'd happy to have that conversation, because if there's no, support for it, if there's no economic argument there, then why would we do it, right? So, it's not to punish anybody or to take something away from somebody. It's because I really firmly believe in this community as a year-round community. I know we have visitors, tourism, and all of that, but that's really when I come to things from a planning perspective, I'm looking at this town as a viable year-round community and not just a snowbird haven, so.
And also making it part of a longer conversation that we need to have on affordable housing, workforce housing.
Absolutely.
But really, because I feel that we're kicking the can down the road so often when projects come and we don't support them. So I would love to have a bigger conversation about.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly
long-term.
agree with that, and that's sort of my resistance when I hear, Chris's point. It's just that we can say, well, this might not work, and this, we never, and then we do it incrementally, but we, how many years do we go along and not do something? When all these other towns are doing something, and, we will get some data eventually, but I'm more action than hesitation personally. But on this issue, just because we've been talking about it, as Jeremy said, for almost 2 years, and here's where we are right now, still with, I think a lot of good stuff, but no answers. And so we're looking to try to get some answers. And again, it will all be up to the voters at the end, and, you know, it may be that there's an uprising and no one will support it, and that's fair, that can happen.
I will just say, there is data to show how these steps support it, as I said earlier, as a regional approach, and that's one of the things is it takes each town to, you know, and somebody mentioned Rockport, you know, Rockport didn't have conversations when they just enacted something. What we're seeing is all these communities that have been doing this in the last year in particular, from Portland to South Portland of different scale, are having broader conversations and really trying to figure it out. And we, you know, but we can sort of say, this is how much housing stock is getting pulled out of real people living in them full time. Like we have those numbers. You know, if you think 300 houses in town in Camden, that's 10% right now that we can pretty much say for sure. That's a significant.
Wait, I just want to,
Well,
clarify.
I'm saying there is data and we can get it.
And I would love to see it. Thank you.
But, yeah, I like the idea of asking, if we're gonna open to the public, I think this is a good time.
Yep, go ahead.
Could I?
Could you step up to the podium and just take your name and residence for us? And-
Well, let me move the,
Or some, yeah.
bring it over.
It's actually like being closer to the microphone.
Bring it
Yeah,
over.
just kind of stand next to Jeannie probably.
Yeah.
I'm Jim Elliott. I live at 10 Pearl Street. And I just have some general comments. I was on the planning board for a couple rounds and on the Board of Selectmen back in the 90s. And I was, right before I went on the select board, a new zoning ordinance was passed in 1992. And one of the things that was really discussed in great detail after a lot of workshops and stuff was the concept of homestays. And there's been a lot of discussion about people renting rooms. Well, that really is enshrined in the zoning ordinance as a homestay. And it's not, and the reason people felt that should happen and people should be able to rent out a room was because a lot of people needed the income to pay their taxes and get by. And I'm not sure that's changed a lot. And I do know people that rent out rooms. Back then, the room rentals were, usually it was like somebody visiting visiting nurse or something like that for a season. It might be an old gentleman coming to town every summer and goes to the same place. Very often it was Maine Photographic Workshops, which is now Maine Media Workshops. It was always looking for people to place in rooms. And they had the discussion at the time in Rockport, and they agreed it was a good thing and they should do that. What wasn't clear, because the short-term rental ordinance that was enacted talked about defined short-term rentals as the use of a dwelling unit or portion thereof. And what's a portion of a dwelling unit is, you're not gonna rent out the kitchen, so they're talking about a bedroom. So this is probably one of the worst ordinances I've ever read. It's not, it really should just be redone. I'm not saying it's not needed, but I think it could really be redone. And because it seems to pull in homestays. My other comment around that is, in the old days, people would rent their homestays, advertise it on the Chamber of Commerce listing, and along with other weekly rentals, and that was very common. That was how the word got out. People would call the chamber and they'd mail them out something. You'd pay the chamber $15 and people would call you up. You'd rent it. You'd rent out a room or whatever. Now with Airbnb, it's, of course, it's changed. So a lot of those homestays are advertised on Airbnb. So I think one of the first things you have to do is, are we going to regulate homestays, and if so, how? And certainly, I don't think anybody would dispute that health and safety are important things. Somebody talked about a tiered approach, and I don't have a homestay, so I'm not shooting my own horn here, but I think that's a little bit of the local economy that needs to be maybe treated differently and preserved. I'm not sure registration and all that is necessary, but in trying to figure out the numbers, I'm sorry, I have a dry mouth, so I have to.
That's okay.
In doing the numbers, you know, and the numbers are amorphous, I think, especially, I would like to know if Bain Capital is buying up properties in Camden. It would be interesting to know that. I haven't seen anything definitive about that. It's almost anecdotal, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'm not clear. I'm sure it's happening in other markets and other places because we know that investment companies are buying up houses. They're buying up whole subdivisions and renting them, short-term or long-term. I don't know whether it's happening here. So I certainly support the idea of getting more information to figure out what is that problem? Is that a problem? So I don't know whether that number of, what was it, 275 to 325 includes homestays or not, because certainly most of them would be listed on, and they should be treated differently. I think the registration system, I don't think anybody should have any problem. Everybody should register, that you can regulate, and everybody should be inspected. I think that's reasonable. I'm a homeowner. I wouldn't want anybody, a guest in my house, to be treated any worse than I would want to treat myself. So why would anybody object to that? The other thing, I picked up a little bit of a tone of us and them, and I think you maybe want to approach this politically with the perspective that probably 95% of people want to comply. They want to do the right thing. They want to follow the rules. And it's not that you shouldn't have enforcement, but the attitude should be, and I'm sure the code office, they work with people. They don't look to hammer people. And I think we should bear that in mind. Probably the only other thing I wanted to say, and this is anecdotal, people talked about available housing and the lack of what is the availability of housing in the dark village thing. I used to call Camden a ghost village when I was on the planning board, and we persevered. We talked about it a lot, and the reason we talked about it, it seemed to be that there was a lot of dark houses, a lot of empty houses. The good news is, and it has a little bit to do with our local economy and a lot to do with the national economy. On Pearl Street, where I live, over half of that first block where I live was dark in the winter. In fact, it got so bad, we used to actually take turns, other neighbors, sitting on front steps handing out candy at Halloween, so the kiddies would have a house to go to, it was really bad. And the last, before the pandemic, but it certainly accelerated with that. And I think it's with the advent of a lot of, started before the pandemic and accelerated remote work. What we have and what we did locally was we built a new middle school and we have great schools. So we have, I think there's 5 new young families on our lower Pearl Street. And the older generation, we're gonna go, some sooner and some later, but you're gonna see a turnover. And I think you need to look more broadly at the issue of available housing. I'm not sure regulating short-term rentals or restricting them is going to increase that. And I base that on another thing that I've seen, and that is under Maine law, if you own a 3-unit apartment building, you have the right, absolute right, to convert them to condominiums and sell them. And in fact, there is a unit near us where that happened. And you would say, well, that's great, and it was converted and all the units were sold. 2 out of the 3 units are owned by Boston professionals. Lovely people, I love them, they're wonderful neighbors, but they're not part of the community. So you can do a lot of local regulation, but at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to beat the market. And if you think you're gonna just restrict one thing and it's gonna make something else happen, it's a lot more complicated than that, I'm afraid. I like what I was hearing about working incrementally. I think, and Tom's comment is well taken. I think, maybe you want to start small and rewrite this awful ordinance. Include registration, decide whether you really want, homestays to register or not. I don't see why not. And it may be if everybody registered, it would make it easier to figure out what's out there. You wouldn't be just guessing that there's a lot of unhosted rentals that aren't registered, and you would have a better sense of what you're dealing with. And rentals, they can be businesses at some point, and certainly the income people get from rentals is treated as business income. But generally, they're thought of as uses, rentals, whether it's short-term or long-term. It's a use, somebody's using a property. So, and you ought to hang on to the zoning ordinance and go that way.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good.
Stephen Gold, Grove Street, and I do own a rental. It's on my property, it's a cottage. But when I first moved to town in 1988, there was a great concern in town about keeping people in their homes, that the cost of living in Camden was getting onerous. Personally, in the last couple of years, my taxes have gone up 20%, and I'm sure with this new reevaluation they're talking about, they're going to go up some more. I do confirm to the 7-day-a-week rental. The truth of the matter is it's a lot easier than having people in and out every 3 days. And especially cleaning help is not easy to find. I disagree with the idea that short-term rentals are competitive with the hospitality industry in town, because probably the minimum price for a room in Camden per night is $250. And there are a lot more that are $295, some are $485, $435, and one as high as $685. The people who rent short-term rentals make a valuable contribution to the community. They go on day sales, they go to restaurants, they buy food. Not to mention, we have the creative workshop in Rockport. We have the photo workshop. We have unknown schools that most of us don't know about. All these people need reasonably priced short-term housing. And besides the reduced price of short-term housing, most short-term housing compared to most, maybe not all, hospitality industries allow children, allow pets, and you cook your own meals. I don't have to tell any of you what it costs to go to dinner in this area. The other issue, not an issue, but one thing that I agree with in concept is, to me, non-residential owned properties that are just rented from afar, that is a commercial enterprise. And that should be, we should have a separate tax category and maybe a separate tax rate for those commercial properties, or alter the assessment based on the fact that these are commercial properties. But, I understand where this is going and what it's going to wind up with. And I'm just saying, on behalf of Camden residents, and especially, I have a unit, but I know people that rent one room in their house and rely on that to make it in this town. Go easy on us.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks to you.
Alex Cohen, 6 Wood Street. About 20 years ago, I was on Camden Affordable Housing Committee, and I was involved in the housing units that were built on Madison Way and Lupin Lane. So to say that our housing issues are suddenly a result of, the proliferation of Airbnb, I think we've been trying to fight this battle for a long time, well before the 20 years ago that those two developments were created. So this is an issue we've got to tackle, not, with everybody, every committee, and to sort of single out short-term rentals, I think is misguided. And I agree with some of the comments today about just the data that we just don't have. But I would just share 20 years ago, we were talking about this, and it wasn't because everybody, on Pearl Street has a short-term rental. So, another issue that I've been a realtor for 20 plus years, I've been doing rental management of various kind of degrees for about 19 years. My mother had a summer house here originally, and I managed her property when she went back to her full-time home. So I started doing the Chamber of Commerce booklet, and that's how it all started. And I was back in the day, that's how we got the word out. So of course this community has had rentals of all kinds since we were a community, because people come here in the summer and they need a place to live, and we have photo workshops and all the other businesses that require housing, and we've had a limited housing stock from the very beginning, and that's just who we are. And we're a vacation town, and we depend on tourism. I mean, we have problems with that dynamic, and they're not easy to solve. So just historically, this is an issue that we have to grapple with. Kind of a one solution, kind of coming down hard on short-term rentals, I don't think is the way to go. And I know you guys have worked hard. I've sort of peripherally known that this was happening, but I didn't realize banning short-term rentals, which is what I heard today, that's what I heard. I heard banning short-term rentals. I heard it. And I heard a 6-week cap as well. I mean, I think that's crazy. I think that's absolutely crazy. And if people knew about that, like if other realtors in my office knew about that, if other business owners, small business owners knew about this, you would have a mutiny. This door would be, standing room only. And that's what will happen. People suggested, this incremental steps, et cetera. Where do people, with our 150 rooms, I don't know how many actual hotel rooms we have in Camden, but that's not enough to support our economy. Okay, if we get rid of most of our housing, short-term housing stock for the summer months or the fall, leaf peepers or Thanksgiving time, Christmas, whenever people come to visit, what's going to happen to our business owners? So there's this economic thing that no one's really talking about, sort of mentioned a little bit, but there's sort of like, I don't know, I feel like, I don't feel like I'm a part of the conversation. Maybe that's my fault. Maybe I haven't been tuned into these meetings. Someone didn't say, hey, Alex, come talk. You've been in the business, what's going on. So I just feel like there's I don't think people understand how these rentals work, and how if you offer a short-term rental for your 6 weeks, and then you're gonna move another person in for the next 9 months or 10 months or whatever, it doesn't, it doesn't work like that. If you're gonna do a 6-week rental, you have to have beds and furniture or something, and then it's you can't just change gears and have someone else kind of move in or something. So I don't, I'm hearing all this today and I'm processing it. So and I read as much as I could read to sort of figure out where things were at, but I just felt mechanically, things don't make sense from what I understand at this moment about kind of the thought process. I just fundamentally think that correlating the lack of long-term rental housing is associated with our short-term rental situation. It doesn't add up either. Take a $500,000 house that you try and buy around here. What's your mortgage payment going to be $2,500, $2,800, you're gonna pay some taxes, so that you're up to $3,500 plus some maintenance. You're okay, so your costs out of pocket, as if you just were gonna rent your house long-term, is you're gonna have to offer that house for $5,000 a month. It doesn't, who's gonna do that? Who's gonna buy a house and rent it long-term? You know, no one buying a house now can do that. Sure, people that owned their houses 20 years ago, don't have a mortgage or have a small mortgage, sure, you know, they can do that. So that's just sort of like a logic thing. I don't understand like how suddenly 20 people on Bayview Street, Chestnut Street, Pearl Street, Lime Rock Street, Belmont Ave, suddenly those houses hit the market, they're gonna sell for big bucks. They're gonna turn around and rent it for $2,500 a month, which is still like a lot of money, but that's a pretty cheap rent. And it's not gonna happen. I've been doing this for 20 years, you know, it's not gonna happen. So like, I just don't think that logic makes sense to me. The idea that, I also think that the concept of your unhosted versus hosted is a little kind of, it's sort of like you're either a resident owner or you're a non-resident owner. Most people that I work with are like, they have a summer house, they have a second house. They come up for the summer, and they go back to Savannah. Or someone who inherited their house on Bayview Street, couple $1 million house, they pay, $50,000 taxes, they rent it, and then they use it for Thanksgiving and other times, and they come up and they enjoy it. A lot of people like that. I've talked to Tiffany Ford, I'm like, how many investors do you work with? 0. It's not like, like there's a perception, like there's like these people that are big bad people that buy houses and are exploiting our town. It's not happening. Same with my real estate sales business. Like, people are not like Alex, like from Timbuktu, like, give me a house so I can rent it and exploit Camden. It doesn't happen. People like buy it, they want to come up and use it, they come up and use it. When they're not here, they rent it, which is way better than having it be vacant, and no one's there, no one's spending money in town, no one's, supporting our economy. So, we have a housing problem, definitely. Let's fix our housing problem, definitely. Sure, we can make our properties safer. No one's gonna disagree with that, let's all make everything safer, but do we wanna have a lot of red tape and a lot of extra work and a lot of processes? You could try it, but most short-term rentals, the other thing this is part of the mechanics that people don't understand, well, we go to those properties every week to clean them. We see exactly what's busted. We go there like every other night to fix the Wi-Fi or fix the battery in the smoke detector. But like 10 at night because it's beeping, you go, so like, sure, there are deadbeat people of all kinds and deadbeat land property owners, there could be a multi-unit guy or, who doesn't take care of their property. And there could be all different kinds of like owners of properties that don't do a good job, and there could be terrible tenants, whether they're long-term or short-term. Whether you're a short-term owner and you've got weekly people and next door is a long-term person, still a tenant living in the building, the long-term tenant doesn't have as much oversight sometimes than the short-term tenant, based on exactly everything I said. And that, just to make the other argument about commercial versus non-commercial use, if you're somebody that buys a multi-unit or buys a single family and you rent it long-term, you're there to make money. That's what you do. You get a commercial loan, maybe you rent that, and that doesn't make you, I don't know, are you different than the guy who, rents weekly? You're still renting the house and you're making money. Is the person renting it weekly making extra money less than the person renting it monthly making money? It's still, is it the amount of return you get that's a problem? It's a residential use. So that's sort of, sometimes we're kind of, the board, I feel, they kind of, oh, this is just a commercial use. You can make the argument that it is, but it's no different than a long-term property owner that's renting their building or their house. I'd also I think the 7 days, as my understanding, the 7-day minimum was sort of a throwback to some N or B and B ordinance from like pre-2000. It sort of was arbitrary. From another economic standpoint, I think if we want to attract people to come visit our town and spend money and recreate and tell their friends and, survive off of this tourist-driven economy, people can't afford to travel 7 days all the time. or they want to travel a couple days here, go to Bar Harbor for a couple days, go, Rangeley for a couple days. So if anything, we should loosen that, like Rockport, and, let the Leaf Peepers come for a long weekend, come up for Thanksgiving or something like that, and if we try and slam a 7-day max, minimum, we might turn off some people. They'll go somewhere else. They'll spend their money where they can. They'll go to Rockport. So, it's just easier to just let, and I know Rockport did a lot of this, did this whole exercise a couple years ago. I was involved in that, I know Randy Gagne spoke about, there was all this perception there were all these violations and nuisances and this and that and parking problems, and as of 2 years ago, there weren't any. Sure, I'm sure there could be things that happen, but things happen with long-term rentals as well. Tenants don't take out the trash, the dog barks, and someone parks in the wrong spot on the street. And so it's just, there could be a reasonable way to go, but any talk of banning is like crazy town.
Yeah, and I'd like may I address that?
Okay, and any talk of from let me just finish up, but just from a basic property rights standpoint, I'm no attorney, but I've been in real estate, and I think if you bought your house, whenever you bought it, and you want to go to Florida for 6 months and a day, or go to Arizona, go to California, I don't care, but you still want your house, you shouldn't be penalized for that, or if you want to sell that house because it's a good property investment to someone else and they're good, suddenly to take some rights that you've had for the whole time you've owned your property, something out of thin air, poof. I'm sorry, Alex, yeah, sorry, you got to do 6 weeks or nothing, or, that's a big problem, I think, if you, and people's situations change. So someone who may not want to rent right now, they have no intention of renting, I don't care. Someone gets sick or somebody moves and they just, hey, I want to rent my house for a year. They should be able to do that. Or, so I think it's like a property rights thing, which could be very inflammatory. And, no one wants more restrictions on the biggest investment in their life, which is their house or their second home, yeah, so just, yeah, and, I would just, I'd love to be more involved. I am going to be more involved. I'm going to try and pay attention to these meetings and speak my voice, but I would kind of, give feedback to the planning board that, this issue of no rentals is that's been going on for a long time. And, building rentals that are like 2-bedroom duplexes, triplexes, like a Sugarloaf condo concept, that's what we need. We don't need like a house on Pearl Street or a house on Baby Street that's 4 or 5 bedrooms. Okay, that's like gonna cost you like a fortune to keep. Yeah. We don't need that, okay? And there's no parking there either. So we,
I'm just gonna ask you to keep the comments down.
I'm wrapping up. But from an economic standpoint, we don't wanna do anything to discourage anybody visiting our town, spending money, and enjoying our town. If anything, we want to encourage people, and we simply, let's make them safer, but the general, direction. So for the select board to kind of chime in, I just want to be very careful with kind of how things go, because I think this is a big hornet's nest, and I don't think a lot of issues are super clear, so that's it.
Would you stay up for a second, Alex?
Yeah.
Just because I want to address some of the things that you brought up. And first of all, I want to state that the planning board really does view this as a collaborative process. So your insight as a local businessman who has worked here and done the real estate for over 20 years, longer than I've been in Camden, okay? So we certainly welcome your insight and your perspective. We have been open to hearing this at any of our meetings, and they are open hearings and public hearings, and so you're always welcome to come and chime in and share your experience and your perspective on that. I want to make clear, it was asked earlier, and I just want to make sure we're perfectly clear on this. No one on the planning board has ever suggested outright banning short-term rentals, period, flat. That has never been stated, not by me. You can go on any tape, you can do anything. What we have said is possibly banning unhosted non-primaries. That's one category. okay? That is one thing that we have said. The question was even asked by someone here today, were you talking about banning all SCRs? Never. That conversation has never come up. So when Jim came and spoke to homestays, we've always sort of endorsed homestays as being like someone who's trying to make a little money, who lives in the home. We've always seen that as an appropriate use. That's one thing. So then the next one is this idea of people spending money visiting towns. We also have people who come in and say they can't get staff to work in their restaurants because they can't afford to live here. Those are competing obligations and balancing. But those things are in, that idea of providing workforce housing and that kind of stuff is in the comp plan. And you may have worked on the comp plan at some point, or at least your committee's work may have been taken into the comp plan. We have had many discussions, and Chris especially because he's been around Camden for a long time, he's a lifetime resident almost.
More or less.
He's talked about the traditional rentals in town and the different people who have, sort of camps and summer homes and all of those things. And those considerations are being looked at, and we do want to preserve some of the character of that nature. It's a very complicated thing, you're absolutely right. But I would point out that your idea that this whole thing is not gonna have, or not gonna, it's just not. I mean, you've got towns all over the state who are doing it, and they're doing it at various levels, and they're doing it for various reasons. Cape Elizabeth is more, as I stated, preservation of the character of the neighborhood. Kennebunk looks a little bit more like safety, right? You got Bar Harbor, they have similar things with the tourism industry and all of that. So we are looking at it from a broad perspective, and we do invite you back. We want to hear your perspective, and it is heard, and it is absorbed. It's not just anybody sitting here crossing their arms and looking off to the sky, because we do appreciate your insight. And I want to make sure that's clear, but I also want to make sure that we're not putting words out there that were not spoken. And that the clear one on that is the banning of short-term rentals outright.
Well, let me just clarify so I don't know what the numbers are, but that's essentially what we have in town. And that's another part of not knowing, this happened before, when you say unhosted, it's sort of like what Jim has a duplex and he sort of lives in half of it and he can rent out the other half, and he's occupying it. So those units are very few and far between. We don't have, sure they exist, but they're a fraction of the rental situation in town. So when you say, you're unhosted, you're basically saying, I don't know what the number is, 95+%. So just so you know.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that, but
Can I?
Yeah.
I know numerous people who do rent out.
But that's why it's alarming to hear that.
And part of a lot of this is there are a lot of terms that get used and they sort of overlap sometimes. And so when we say unhosted, is that owner occupied unhosted versus owner, and so a lot of what we're even just trying to do is clarify those definitions and really be able to make the distinction and recognize that the distinction between someone who does not live in the property, who does not live in the community, and it is strictly rented, versus someone who lives in the house 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and not say any of those are necessarily banned or outlawed, but just make the distinction.
Yeah.
And I just want to point that out because part of this conversation, a lot of the conversations that we're trying to have is to sort of say, just so that we all understand the same terms that we're using, and so that we don't have these confusions and we don't have these misunderstandings, because it is a complicated, touchy subject.
Yeah. Well, I'll just finish. I think my reaction is severe because that's my understanding of what rentals are in town.
Yeah.
It's not Jim Elliott renting the half of his duplex.
He said he doesn't rent anything, didn't he?
So
He doesn't have a homestead.
yeah, no, he did. Yeah, he doesn't actually.
Yeah.
But it's the person from who lived here, moved to Switzerland, and or the person that inherited the house on Bayview Street or wherever, and they are not residents. They don't vote here, so they are going to fall into your category. And I'm just saying, when you say ban unhosted, your words mean something very severe, as I understand it, which is essentially every rental that I am associated with. Every person I deal with from a real estate standpoint, they're going to retire here. Okay, in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, they buy a house, they're gonna rent it, they are not residents, they're gonna be damned.
Under my scenario, and again, I'll just wear the hat, right, on this one, if it's my perspective we're talking about, not the planning board, but me personally. Under those conditions, they're certainly free to rent that house under 30-day lease. We've already put that in as one of the possibilities as not being short-term, right? Our definition of short-term is anything under 30 days. So if they want to go and live abroad, and they want to put their house in the rental market for any period of time on a minimum term of 30 days, that's something we've considered allowing. So we're not taking away, and that's very important, that the planning board has looked at that perspective. We are looking at what is more of a transient nature versus more of a longer term rental. And so we have looked at that and identified that as one thing. And that's the other thing I wanted to circle back on. One of your first statements was that we're looking at one approach to solve this problem. That is absolutely not the case. The planning board, before the state passed the new regulations on housing and density and all that stuff, the planning board was already looking at those issues and had already addressed it in numerous ways. And we are now obligated in the next year and a half to incorporate the things that the state also passed. And we are looking at any option available to us to increase housing density and to allow for more buildable lots and all of those things. And we have done those on our own initiative, without waiting for the state, and now the state is following suit, not that they're following our lead. But we aren't looking at this as a silver bullet to solving the housing crisis in Maine or in Camden. We are looking at it as but one prong of a fork that might help alleviate some of the pressure. That's the way we view it. That's it.
Yeah. We have at least one more person I believe that would like to speak.
Very briefly.
Promise.
I trust you.
Bob Daigle, Pearl Street. Been here about 8 years, and one of the things we were doing, I was in the Portland area for about 35 years, and this is going to be our forever house. We found a nice house, but realized that it had increasing costs and all that kind of stuff over time, and at some time I wouldn't be able to afford it. Built a garage. I am one of the other guys, the little ones, Airbnb, little Airbnb, 2 people. We take out the garbage, we clean the place, we take care of it ourselves. I work very closely with the planning board over this fine young person here and others, and made sure I was within the regulations of the town at that time so that we would be able to do it. I'd be really distressed if the rules started to change, that changed those rules that I went and took out loans to be able to make that work for us, for our family. This is our house. We live in the house. We have a wonderful little space, fully safety with all the proper stuff, stairways, extra egress ways to get out. Have did it in the way it was supposed to be done. So all I say is I wouldn't want to be penalized. At the same time, I listen to this fine gentleman over here, and I think about the concept of people from away. I read about it all the time in the paper, buying up, and then renting it out, not there. I've seen it within Airbnb, and because I'm an Airbnb, this little guy, I see horror stories, absolute horror stories. You know, rented out to a nice young couple, oh, my daughter's coming, and 100 people show up in their neighborhood. We don't want that. So I just do it not to make a lot of money. Talking about the numbers of what it costs to rent around here, we charge $140 a night. And so that way people can come in, and some of those folks from the school, the boat building school and the furniture school, those are the kinds of people we like to have.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak?
I'd say one more short. I should remember all the things that you said. But what I would like to say is, to me at least, it's a myth to think that any reduction in short-term rental is going to change the housing, situation in town. In town, as far as I know, no house, say in the last year, has sold for the listing price. They've all sold for more than the listing price. So my feeling about this is fine. We're talking about the right stuff. But in terms of affordable housing, you have to build it.
Yeah, and that's why we distinguish between affordable and available, but I hear you still, even the point applies.
Available is just going to be more of the kind of people we have now.
All right, but would you, I mean, it's a value judgment. Would you rather see a short-term commercial type establishments
No,
or a
no.
family living in a house.
I'd rather see a family living in a house.
Me too.
Okay, but at Camden prices, there aren't a heck of a lot of them that are going to families.
Right.
You know?
But
Just
some of
that's-
the value, though, that they can go for is because people know that they can buy them and hold on to them and not live there, but they know that these short-term rentals are viable
But like,
options.
one of
That's
the things
part
I
of the
alluded
inflated
to
prices.
before, if they buy them and say, I'm coming here in 5 years, then for those 5 years, they're a commercial property. And when they decide to move here full-time, which I don't think we should spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on consultants, I really believe that a high school intern with a laptop and the tax rolls and the voting rolls could do a heck of a good job of determining what's what.
We're well past our time, we're, 10 minutes past 5, and we have a whole other agenda item.
Anybody else want to speak on this real quick? I just want to.
We will be having more talks about it at the planning board
Yeah,
meeting, I'm sure, so.
we welcome your input and coming and visiting and hanging out with us.
I may have to go. I have a child waiting for me. Do we have a set time where we're gonna end this, or are we gonna
Tell
keep
us how
going?
long you have, and we'll try and meet your deadline.
I just feel bad. I told my kids I was gonna be back at 5 and they're supposed to go somewhere and, but maybe I just feel like I can't.
Well, I don't know how much we really have on piers. It could be a lot. You think it's a lot?
I very much support what I read in that memo. I'll say that, but.
I was gonna say, we know where you are.
Yeah.
Ask Jeremy to give us the intro at least.
Yeah.
And so we all can find.
Can I just say, if anybody wants to get on the agenda mailing list for the planning board discussions and is not on it, leave your name and email, and I'll add you.
Thanks, Jeannie. Jeremy, are you there?
Sure. You hear me?
We're gonna try to get an overview of the pier issue, if you can keep it as brief as possible, and we'll see if we can make some headway.
Sure, I'll do my best. Yeah, so I think as everyone knows, there's a pier and other structure moratorium currently in place. That was voted on by voters this past June, over a year ago. And it's been extended once and then twice. And we have to extend them in 180-day increments. That's under state law. And at the same time, you need to make considerable progress on moving any regulations forward that would address the concerns and issues identified in the moratorium that was approved by voters. And for the new board member, Chris, I don't know if you followed this, but what happened, it went to voters. The voters approved the moratorium. We extended it. And then, well, before we extended it, the select board tasked the Harbor Committee with addressing the moratorium. The Harbor Committee spent many months looking at it. They came up with their recommendations. The planning board did not get involved. The Harbor Committee was just doing their work. The piers and other structures are regulated under the harbor ordinance, as well as under the land use ordinance, the shoreline zoning section of the land use ordinance. So there are two ordinances that are at play. Harbor Committee does their thing, and the planning board has their piece, and those regulations need to be consistent. The planning board took the Harbor Committee's recommendations, had a public hearing on it. They took public comment that came from a handful of citizens, as well as the Conservation Commission provided a letter about piers, whether or not there should be any more. The planning board at the time during the public hearing, their hearing was based on the recommendations that the Harbor Committee did, and so I crafted regulations to be consistent with those recommendations. The planning board at the time felt they should just move those along to the select board because time would, you need to make progress on this issue. The select board then, right at about the same time, this would have been in March, early March, late February, extended that moratorium another 180 days. That gets us out to September. The planning board, again, had a public hearing on this issue, on these proposed changes. At the same time, the planning board has, I think, a little different perspective on piers than the Harbor Committee did. And they've discussed that at a couple of workshops. They haven't gone into great detail other than I think there's general consensus amongst the planning board that there should be no more piers in the outer harbor and even in the coastal harbor at all. And that's consistent with the Conservation Committee's their comments. But that's where we are. We're kind of, I don't want to say stuck because we're not stuck. We just need some direction from the select board on the path forward. And the path forward is either, because again, you got to make progress. You can't be sitting and just not doing anything on this. And we're trying, but it's hard without a little bit of direction. The paths forward could be direct the planning board and the harbor committee to kind of dive into it again, what the planning board's thinking and the comment that's come from the planning board and their hearing about looking at whether or not we should prohibit any more in the outer and coastal. The outer harbor is a line from, so you know, is from a line from the yacht club property against the Kastner property, going across over to Lyman Morse and then out to Sherman's Island and everything. No, Sherman's Island, sorry. Everything out beyond that is the coastal harbor going up to Lincolnville and down to Rockport.
Jeremy, the last page of our packet includes that.
Yes,
map.
okay.
So we can see that.
So that's kind of where we are. We could move the select board needs to make that call on whether or not you need to continue the moratorium in one fashion or another, because we don't get to November without doing an extension. But I do think it's critically important to move something along. I'm sorry, it's too loud for me. I don't know what's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's GD
That's
holding the
my
map.
fault, that's my fault.
All right. So again, the planning board kind of, I think, has their perspective now that public comment was taken at a public hearing and they dove into it a little bit more. They differ from the harbor committee. The harbor committee hasn't taken this back up.
Jeremy, can I just jump in on that? I
Sure.
disagree that we differ. The planning board recognized the work of the harbor committee as being detailed, involved, and we actually set that on because we agreed with pretty much everything that was in there. We just had an option on our side. We were not tasked with anything.
Right.
My understanding is the harbor committee was essentially under the impression that they were not allowed to or did not discuss outright ban because it was not on the table. So there's not really a disagreement so much as just that we were talking about, we had an opportunity to discuss something different. And I want to make sure that's clear because we did support pretty much everything that the harbor committee did. If we're allowing new piers, yes, let's go with what the harbor committee did. But if not, can we have a discussion about should we allow them at all? What is the value of the town versus the public access, all those other environmental concerns, everything else. So I just want to make sure that that's clear.
I think that's fair. I mean, I don't think the select board, they didn't direct them one way or the other. And I think it's I think fair that the harbor committee could have decided, right? There was a prior harbor committee that said we should have no more piers. And that got stuck at the select board level going back a number of years. And that was kind of the harbor committee and the planning board joint at that point. But the harbor committee reviewed it and they assessed the current regulations on them. And they said in the outer harbor, there could be 4 more piers. And I think that was from their perspective, I think they looked at density because that was an issue. One of the items identified in the moratorium was density of piers. So they had to address that. And density could mean we're maxed out, right? I mean, that we can't have any more. We don't need any more. But I think the harbor committee looked at it and said, there's 4 more under the current ordinance or current regulations in the outer harbor. Coastal harbor, they didn't think that there was an issue with any of them because of the ruggedness of the coast. But I agree with you, Ethan, that you guys did not disagree with what their report said. You guys just went a little bit further.
Right, and I think that's fair. So just to move that along, the other thing that has come up, and I've raised it before with the select board when I was invited, I think at one point to speak on the piers. The 2-tiered approval process to me still seems very awkward, where the piers come to the planning board for approval, and then they go on to the harbor committee first, then to the planning board, and then to the select board. That's an unusual application of approvals in our code. We don't do that anywhere else as far as I know. We don't get a site plan ordinance or site plan review come in. We look at it, the select board and say, okay, planning board, now you sign it. Because what you normally would do is just take our thing and say, yes, they did their job, and then check it. The harbor ordinance, you know, the process of going, I'm not talking about the ordinance itself, clear on that. We're talking about the approval of an actual pier application. The process of going to the harbor committee, then to the planning board, and then on to the select board is unique and duplicative in my opinion.
It's not what the ordinance says either. The ordinance, harbor committee, select board, planning board, but we have this past practice of doing it
Right, well,
a different way for 20 years.
Yeah.
I think, and Allison, you've brought this up in the past, I actually like the double review for the purpose, the reason being the harbor is a public asset. We're not, the planning board isn't approving a project on a private piece of land.
Mm-hmm.
The planning board is approving a project on a public asset, which is Camden Harbor.
But it was,
These piers extend.
That's why it should happen at the end, like the planning board review is supposed to be the site plan review after the select board had given sort of conceptual review, which is that public asset part of it, and then the planning board part, at least in the, is their job would be to implement any of the things that the select board may have, you know, said during that, or.
Right, and I didn't mean to raise this as
But
like
it's
something.
a terrible process.
There's other pieces of this that we're really actually
Yeah.
wanting to talk about. And I think it's worth highlighting what the components that the harbor committee recommended, which we all supported, and we did have hearings, were making piers that are modifiable for sea level height and changing the maximum height as it currently is so that they can be higher above sea level. And the other one is the land accessible floats or land attached floats, which we currently don't have anything in our ordinance. Anybody with a property can put a ramp to a float anywhere in the harbor or anywhere. So those two pieces from the harbor committee, which we had hoped would get on the ballot in June, but didn't, are still on the table. And we really think that those need to just go forward. But we need to, the select board needs to extend the moratorium to cover that period between September and November on the ballot. And then there's the conversation about
new
piers overall.
Yeah, and just to clarify, that would apply to anybody who is repairing a pier. They could then raise the height of that pier.
Repairing or rebuilding.
Yeah, because we're looking at likely sea level rise. I think we all are aware that there's at least some, you know, pretty good chance that we're gonna be looking at, you know, 2 feet somewhere in the next number of years, and these piers are gonna be underwater for some places, so at high tides and storm events and things like that. So Chris was absolutely right. Those things we think should go forward. Our perspective is not much harm if we just say no more piers. That's our perspective. There's harm to individual property owners, but we're talking about literally 4 plus the coastal harbor.
Right, I think what the wording was that adding 4 piers in one location and one in another would not have a significant impact to the beauty of the town and the view. And that the 6 foot versus 8 foot piece, that seemed to me like pretty reasonable. I'm not sure about the ability to raise and lower for sea level, how.
Not lower, just raise.
Raise for.
If you're building a pier, it's not.
How hard is that?
It's not actually all that complicated. If you're having.
Esther is doing it. So.
I can tell you because.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, if you're dealing like these, most of the piers that we're talking about are set on granite. And you get Proc or an equivalent company, they come in with a barge, they pick up the deck structure, they put some granite, pin it, and set it back down.
Right.
I mean, it's not cheap, but.
We've had testimony from Garland and Dorsey. They've come in and said, you know, they're doing a lot of the designs of these, and they're saying pretty much all of them now are being built with that technology.
The last 2 that we approved are designed with that kind of.
And then it was like 300 feet apart, right? Those are like number of things, you know, the 300 feet apart, 8 feet, modifiable.
Yeah, and my soapbox is I spend a lot of time in the harbor, in this harbor and also in Belfast, and I almost never see these things being used, ever. Like, it's not that they are never used, I can't go on record and say that, but I do not see them being used. And so therefore, what is the benefit to the town, public spaces, all of that stuff, when they're really just a luxury? And they're a luxury that really, they're not entitled to, it's just we don't have an ordinance that limits it right now or restricts it. So that's my perspective on that.
I'm sorry, it's not a question of being entitled. Some of these people bought those properties under the current ordinances with the expectation that they would be able to build a pier if they wanted to.
I don't know if that's true or
So
not, but it's possible. It's certainly possible.
It's certainly possible,
But-
we have to.
but just because-
And the second thing, I mean, I think regulating the coastal harbor, I mean, if anybody wants to build a pier in a coastal harbor, be my guest.
Well, but you're not concerned about any environmental damage out there?
Who would build, I
But
mean.
nobody, but somebody
Nobody,
might.
I mean.
Somebody might.
Actually,
yes,
well,
they
hang
will.
on, because we have one on the books. Lincolnville has passed their own moratorium because somebody wanted to put a pier in the same section that we're talking about, south of the ferry terminal. It would have been 450 feet long. And just because we can look at that section of the coast and say, well, that would be a bad place to build a pier, doesn't mean that someone isn't going to do it. And here's the thing, because I was back and forth on this for a long time. The piece that I look at is I come out of Camden Harbor and I go, you come around Sherman's Point and you look north to Lincolnville, and there's not a structure sticking out into the water. And we have a chance to, part of what we are doing as the planning board and as a select board, deciding, we mentioned character of community, that stretch of the coastline could be protected. And we've seen in my lifetime, that was true from Camden to Rockport. You didn't see any piers out there either, and now there are 2, if not 3. And we have the chance to protect that.
And Chriso, I think, I don't want to speak for him, but has wavered between coastal harbor and outer harbor as like, he's like coastal harbor, absolutely, he's in favor of banning. He's not, now I think he's come around on the outer harbor, but that's just our perspective, it's one board, but that's our viewpoint on it. Allison?
I think it would be, I went back and I read all the old articles from the original harbor ordinance and then back in 2015 when both the planning board and the harbor committee recommend banning additional piers in the outer harbor. And one of the things that they did each time is they took like a field trip with, I forget whether it was the select board and the planning board or it was just either one, but they went out in the harbor and looked. And the other time when we talked about this before, it's often been during the winter, I guess maybe when everybody has more time, but you don't get the benefit of seeing all the different stuff that's out there. When I spent a lot of time out there too and trying to get to Sherman's Cove, and I mean, it's very, very busy with kayakers, especially, you've got these main channels, and some people are using the harbor just to get out to the bay so that they can sail. Some people are using the harbor just to putt around the harbor. And so those channels are getting pretty busy. And if you think about the future, like I personally can get really excited about some of the stuff that Lyman Morris is proposing, or even a municipal pier somewhere, so when I think about like preserving the harbor, it's like, how can it's a very popular place, it seems to be getting busier and busier. How do we, when you start to put these big structures that are only for one property out there, you're limiting potential like future mooring space. Some of the reason that there aren't moorings in these certain places is because it's been too shallow, but you get 2 feet of sea level rise over there, you've got some more mooring space. Or you think about, like, I'd like to preserve the last little bit of structure additions that we could make to the harbor to do something that's going to benefit potentially lots of people. Like, like what Lyman Morris does is, think what you will about that, but there's a way, at least if we decide to have more stuff out there, so many people get to use it, or
not the public.
Well,
yes, the public does get to, like, my kids are in sailing camp and stuff, the public doesn't get to use it, sure they do.
But if Lyman Morris builds a pier, it's a Lyman Morris pier.
But
Well, it's not a public utility.
Well, we've talked about public-private
But
partnerships.
there's 2 separate, I mean, it's a business, so the public can have access to it.
No,
but
you should pay for it.
Well, if they,
I also wanted to touch on something that you said about people's expectations when they buy. We already have limited, and like, we approved a pier, a year and a half ago in Sherman.
Yeah.
In Sherman's, can I make my point? In Sherman's Cove, and when we were discussing it, because of the setbacks to the other 2 properties, because that pier went in, it meant that the abutter no longer has the right or the means to build a pier, because our current zoning ordinances say there are only so many, then the setbacks and 250 feet. So we've already got a position of saying you could buy a property in Camden Harbor and think you're going to be able to build a pier and then find out too late because your neighbor already has one.
Or the review process that we go through, and historically, that harbor committee or planning board and select board process that asks you to go through, is this gonna have a significant impact on this, or this? Their different boards have interpreted that in different ways. There have been many peer proposals that have come forward that the previous harbor committee or the planning board or whoever has said, oh no, that one mooring displaced, that's a significant impact. It's a significant impact to, too close to the yacht club, or so, significant impact or not a significant impact is everybody that buys a property knows that they are gonna have, in order to build a pier, they would have to convince multiple bodies that there was no significant impact. So it's not a done deal. It's never been a done deal.
And just one last thing, that because Jeremy mentioned that I sort of gone back and forth, I've also had the opinion, it's I do that so often. I don't know, I did that even before you were here. But, because my point, or at one point, and I still agree with the sentiment, like, it is a harbor, and harbors have piers, and they have docks, and they have things, so, it's a working, busy harbor, but I also then look at, it's 4, really 3, because I think that number 4 includes Lake Beach, that the town potentially could build a pier on Lake Beach, which we probably wouldn't do. But what function or purpose do they serve? Does it add a good to the community? And that's where I sort of have started to come down on saying we don't really need it, because they just don't do a lot, and that the people who own those properties will have access to the harbor however they want. So that's, I think, summing up a lot of our conversations.
So we're past 5:30.
Yeah.
Jeremy, Ethan, what is it that you need from the select board? What do you need us to do moving forward? Obviously, an extension, you need us to.
Yeah.
Name that.
Thanks, Tom.
Chris summed it up beautifully, the height,
We want to go forward with we definitely think we need to go forward with what we discussed from the harbor committee, those recommendations of the height, the adjustability, and the land attached floats.
Right.
And that if we can get that on the November ballot, but we need the select board to extend the moratorium one more time so that covers the 2 months between
there's a gap.
September and
well,
December.
I think the real question is, do you want to, if you want to ban them, then we can't send to voters what the harbor committee did and what you had a public hearing on them, and then voters vote on that because that doesn't ban them, and then the moratorium goes away. So I think there's probably a creative way that Bill Kelly and I can craft something. I don't even know how to do that, because it wouldn't apply to, if you want to prohibit them, why are you going to put those ordinances into a place? Would those be for existing piers when they're replaced?
Or that they can modify, because the two things that I think are really important in that are, one, the land attached floats.
Yep.
And the changing of the height that is retroactive, so that any existing modify.
Right. That's helpful. That's helpful. So what I can do, if that's where the board is, and we can have a workshop at our next one, Tom, what the planning board can have, and then I'll meet up with, I saw Josh in the background. I'll talk with Josh from the harbor committee. But we will need to get to the select board probably the last meeting in August, in order to make sure we're complying with a 180-day extension and figure out what we get to the voters. We're going to have to move kind of quickly because of deadlines, but we can do that to address the issues that Chriso just addressed, and probably continue the moratorium on for another 180 days. You have to do in those 180-day periods of time. At which point, the planning board and harbor committee should have that discussion again on banning them and drafting an ordinance that would prohibit any new ones.
I'm not sure that we need to go that route, but I'm open to it. I'm certainly willing to meet with the harbor committee, but really I think in the end, the determination is going to be the determination of the select board whether or not they have a stomach for just banning the final 3 or 4
Yeah, right,
years. And
right.
so I don't think you need us to do that. We've gone through the hearings on that.
Okay.
So that's my perspective. So if the select board that's what I would suggest, Mom, is take up that discussion to decide if there's a stomach for banning the final 3 or 4 piers in the harbor, and then looking at the coastal harbor as well, if you want to address that. The planning board's already spoken. I mean, we don't have any control over what happens from here.
Okay, I will say, Jeremy, I think,
They have comments.
we have some public, but, isn't it August 8th? And Audra, maybe, you want to chime in on that? Don't we have, if we want something on the November ballot, our last scheduled meeting to get it on the November ballot is August 8th.
Hold on. Katrina sent out a new schedule today. Let me look at it really quick.
So this will have to come together fairly quickly if we want any of those, height adjustability.
Well, those two have already gone through planning board hearing.
Those are already informed to go for.
Okay.
They've already been-
I would say that really the primary decision that the select board needs to make is really that question of, are you going to, adopt the recommendations of the harbor committee that were sent to the planning board to work into the zoning ordinance? Or is there something different you want to do, such as banning the remaining 3 and 4?
Okay.
I'm looking right now at the timeline, Tom.
But I think that, you don't need to have everything in front of you, like the ordinance is finalized and in front of you to have that policy discussion as a select board.
I agree with that. So Jeremy, while you're looking, we're just gonna we have 2 people who want to speak, so we're gonna allow them to come up to the podium and you can interject after, okay?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Josh Moore, Chairman of the Harbor Committee. I guess I'm here as a member of the public. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things that were said. That number one, when we were tasked by the select board to review the moratorium, they gave us some pretty clear guidance on exactly what we should be reviewing. And they said, stick to the moratorium. This is the wording. Here it is. This is what the voters passed. Don't go beyond it. So there was a discussion at the select board level about process, planning board, harbor committee, select board, and this little dance that happens. That was not in our purview, and we did not take it up. So I just want to be real clear that that was something that we didn't shirk or anything. We just were told not to sort of go there. But then the most important one was we went into this with no preconceived ideas about anything. We did not go into it saying, well, we're not going to ban any piers. We want to allow X. We said, let's start over. Yes, there was in 2014, 15, whatever it was, there was a completely different harbor committee and a completely different select board that came to some rulings, and it never went anywhere, essentially, it died. We said, we're gonna look at this with the 7 people that we have in the room and the people we invited. So we did just that. So was banning piers on the table? Absolutely, all piers. When we went through our evaluation, through the people that we were able to get to help us, we determined that 4 residential piers, 3 on the west side and 1 near Lake Beach. There is a 5th pier that could potentially be installed on Lake Beach property, on a municipal property. Both of the ones by Lake Beach are pretty much unfeasible because it's so dry there at low tide. It wouldn't really have much of a thing. But if heaven forbid sea level rise permits it, then that would be an option, yes. So anyway, we came up with that decision. I just wanted to be super clear on what we did and what we didn't do. And then lastly, we did reach out. I know there's been some comments in other meetings about this being a closed process. And I tried to look through all my agendas, and I lost track, honestly, of how many times this was on our agenda, which is on the town website, every time we have a meeting. And I think it was 10 times. It might have been 12, it might have been 9, I'm not sure. But it was a lot. It was literally every meeting, starting in last July. Yeah. So to Allison's point about this happening in the wintertime, it started in July. Yeah. And many of us on the harbor committee are in the harbor every single day. So we're pretty intimately aware of how the harbor gets used and all of that. So we did reach out to the Conservation Commission, we did reach out to the Planning Board, we did reach out to others to sort of, and most importantly, we reached out to Bill Kelly. And if the Planning Board or the Select Board or both want to continue making more progress, he likes to, he's very well-researched, and he gives a rather lengthy speech, or lesson, but it's a very useful one about what property rights people in the outer harbor and the coastal harbor have. And they were different, to be perfectly honest, than I thought going into it. So I was like, oh, I didn't quite understand how that works. And a property owner in the outer harbor is the town of Camden, for instance. So that was a very useful piece, and that may be something that the Select Board or the Planning Board wants to do.
Thanks, Josh.
Yep.
I will confirm that Josh harassed me and threatened me to show up at his meeting.
Can I ask Josh a clarifying question, just to summarize?
Yep.
I just want to make sure I got this right. So these are all like yes, no, real quick. So it was the Harbor Committee's recommendation to do the 8-foot?
Yes.
And also it was the recommendation on 300 feet apart?
That's in the existing ordinance.
That's existing.
Okay, and you're like, okay, that's good.
Yep.
And you said good in the 4 piers, plus 1 or late beach.
The existing ordinances create the ability to have 4 piers based on the research that was done for us.
And the Harbor Committee would say, was their recommendation not to ban piers?
No.
Current ordinance was adequate.
Yeah, that's the way we looked at it.
And you were for also the floating land attached?
Yes, that was something that
Add that
happened
to the ordinance.
a year or two, or a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
That became, I wouldn't call it a loophole, but something that we discovered was missing in the ordinance, and we said, while we're at this, because it is a pier, we defined it as another structure, it is another structure in the outer harbor. We said, let's make sure it gets the same review as everything else does.
Okay. I just want to make sure I was right.
No Perry Mason moment?
No,
That's all right. Can I chime in on dates, Tom?
I'm sorry, you got the memo in front of him now, but yeah, you can.
Go ahead, tell everybody, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, it's super tight. July 25th is the last day of notification to the select board of a planning board proposed ordinance. And the last date for the select board to hold a hearing is August 8th on those changes. So, I mean, that's like super fast, because we'd have to have a hearing. I mean, Jeannie's probably trying to do the math right now, looking at the calendar would be my guess.
I've already did it already.
Yeah, I mean, that is super tight for a planning board hearing. We could try to do something. I would add, and I'm just throwing this out because I think this has been a discussion in town for, a while now. I don't, other than someone that could come in quickly and propose a pier, I don't think there, and maybe you don't necessarily need to agree with me, but I'm just thinking about process and simple process. We could move forward with the current proposal that the Harbor Committee did. The planning board had a recommendation, had a hearing on. That's ready to go to you guys for a hearing and to put on the ballot. We could do that. Get that to ballot. You guys do an extension, right? Because we need that anyway to get to the ballot in November. But we could, in theory, do that. And at the same time, the planning board then could hold more, public hearings moving forward on banning them. So you could almost say that this is a 2-step process. We move this forward and then move that along to ban them in the future election, like in June. The only pier that I'm aware of in the coastal harbor, I have heard nothing about any outer harbor piers proposed. There is one in the coastal harbor. This is on Outer Bayview. This has gone to the Harbor Committee already. It has its DEP permits, its Army Corps permits. It went to the planning board already, went through that process, The select board did not hear it because it was approaching the June ballot. So they wanted the June ballot to see what the voters did. But that one's sitting out there. So that's the only one that I'm aware of. And this is one that's adjacent to another property that property owner has recently purchased. So there is some questions that I have from a DEP permitting perspective on whether or not an adjacent property that's owned by the same entity is allowed to have another pier based on DEP standards for their rules. So I'm just throwing that out as an option, Tom and the select board, because again, August 8th happens very quickly, and the board, we could try to draft something. We would also have to do tweak the harbor ordinance again. That doesn't need a public hearing. That goes to a public hearing with you guys strictly. But we're still dealing with those deadlines of August 8th. But that's just a little easier, less of a hearing at the harbor committee or harbor ordinance too. I'm happy to, I don't know, do whatever you guys want to do. Does that make sense what I laid out?
I think we understand what you're saying.
Yep. And we'll dig into it, Jeremy. We'll come up with a process that we can make a decision quickly about what we want to bring before the board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could put that on another agenda, select board agenda, Tom, if you want.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Right, Bruce Peel, I'm secretary of the Harbor Committee, and I live at 13 C Street. And I heard some things that I feel a little bit differently on, or some of the things, maybe misunderstandings. One, you can't just go build anything you want in coastal harbor. The only thing that's different is that there's no 300-foot setback. It has to pass all the environmental, DEP, Army Corps of Engineers. Also, the piers, the length of the pier and the ramp and the size of the float are all set too, and that's going to prevent most of them out in the coastal harbor because you can't build it to that size. That was number one. Two, the environmental impacts that we're talking about, the Army Corps and the Maine Department of Environmental Protection are extremely strict, and you have to pass a very strict amount. We thought that was very adequate, more than adequate, so that wasn't a concern. And in addition to that, somebody said about alternatives. Part of the Army Corps of Engineer is that if you have an alternative way of getting onto the harbor, you can't build a pier.
Well, has that ever resulted in the pier being denied? Because everybody can use the.
Yeah, I don't know how they designed it.
Respectfully, anybody can go use Lyman Morrison and take their.
Or steamboat landing, or I think they say in a certain distance or convenience that,
And I guess I would just say that I agree with it's challenging and difficult and right now unlikely to see piers in the coastal harbor, but that doesn't mean it's impossible.
No, I agree with that.
And that doesn't mean that someone could buy any of those properties from here to the Lincolnville town line and say, I'm gonna spend $1 million to put a 500-foot pier out there.
No,
I mean, they would have to go through all of the processes. I get that.
They would have to change the ordinance, and that's something you have to vote on.
Right, we won't get to 500.
If it's 500, I'm throwing out 500 as whatever, it's possible.
It is possible.
It's not a good idea. I think most of us look at that section of the harbor and say it'd be a terrible place, but that doesn't mean that someone isn't gonna have a lot of money and say, I want a pier in front of my house.
Yes, but they have to be able to be built within those things. Sometimes they might have if they built it, maybe the float would be 30 feet above the water, because that's as far as the ramp can go. But that's what I'm just saying, that there already are, a lot of these protections are already built into our current ordinance and the Army Corps of Engineers and the Maine Department of Environmental Protection.
Thank you.
I mean, I will say it's pretty safe to say we will be bringing something before the board. I'll talk to you and Stephanie and Allison and Audra and Jeremy, and we'll get something before the board. We have to make some decisions, obviously, and the big one seems to be the moratorium. The other stuff,
You mean the ban?
excuse me,
Yeah.
the ban. The other stuff is, we're gonna see it for sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think this has been very constructive, everybody, and I appreciate all the time. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for showing up. And we'll let everybody get home to their dinner and whatever else they got planned. And we'll be sending something along.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.